Chapter 13:18. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:44 and 26 seconds p.m. Chapter 13:18. Good. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 13:18. Good. Lionel shot forward, his divine armor appearing on his body. His palm flipped over, forming a claw with his fingers curled toward the sky. As though a wild beast, he sliced upward, the rupturing glass of space following his every movement. But what was even more dangerous were the tendrils of destruction that filled in the cracks, layering Lionel's strike with a violent abandon that shook the core. Bang! Lionel's claw and the Rapak's axe kick met, but it was the latter that found itself sprawling backward. That's the first effect. Destruction cripples force, not much unlike anarchic force, burning it to ashes. Lionel's steps shifted, his claw morphing as he pressed his fore and middle finger together into a short spear. He pierced forward as the Rapak stumbled back, its leg now thrown high into the sky. After 2 battles with the Rapaks, Lionel had already learned of their weaknesses. The race as a whole had poor posture. At first it looked like a coincidence, but after 3 encounters, it most definitely wasn't. For an entire race to share the same habit, there was clearly a reason for this. When the Rapaks hunched over, their spines coiled, the plates that covered their torsos were as tight and compact as possible, making the more fragile joints almost impossible to target. At best, one would be able to attack non-lethal areas like the arms and legs. However, when forced to open up, the joints went from non-existent and snapped closed to open by a sliver. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next.com to experience faster update speed. In truth, this couldn't be said to be a weakness at all. Even when standing to their full height, the gaps in the Rapak's plate armor was at most counted in millimeters. In addition, the skin of the Rapaks was especially tough, albeit not nearly as tough as their steely carapace. Still, it could be said that the defenses of their exposed flesh was only 2 or 3 ticks below Lionel's own when he activated his bronze runes. That alone was enough to make them impervious to lower-tier bronze weapons. Still, this slight and almost negligible flaw was more than enough for Lionel. Beseech you. No, I'm wrong. That's too simple and doesn't give destruction enough credit. It's not burning things to ash, it's erasing it from existence. This is the reason why the Rapaks, despite not emitting force and keeping it circulating within its body, can still have its strength weakened by me. Lionel had yet to meet a Rapaks that used an external source of force. And yet, his destruction characteristic still had the effect of greatly weakening its attack. On the surface, this didn't make much sense unless he was underestimating the effect of his Scarlet Star force from the very beginning. Lionel's spear force pierced through the more fragile skin of the Rapaks, slicing through its body and incinerating its inner organs to ash. More. This isn't enough. The moment Lionel appeared outside once again, he had already leapt forward. This time there was only a single platform to choose from, once again about 2 meters ahead of him. When he landed, he found himself in a new world once more, facing yet another Rapaks. Lionel wasn't a fool. He had realized many things by now. The rules and regulations of this true selection seemed almost too loose. They didn't limit who could group with who, they didn't make any effort to separate allies and even threw them all in the same village without a care, and they made no attempt to regulate what might be seen as unfairness. But was this entirely true? This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next.com to experience faster update speed. Lionel felt differently. In fact, he believed that the Void Palace had a perfect pulse on everything that was happening. All things considered, the appearance of the subdimensional zone seemed completely random, especially if there was a trial like this one waiting not long after. That was unless one considered the one thing a zone could do perfectly that anything else might slip up with, and that was counting the number of individuals in a party. Lionel's segmented cube could hide people from far too many methods of detection. And Lionel wasn't the only one with a treasure that could accomplish such a feat, especially with so many young geniuses with astonishing backgrounds around. So, the Void Palace borrowed the power of the regulator to shore up potential loopholes. Using the zone, they saw through any hidden trump cards a youth might have. Then, after doing this, they threw these simulations at the group one after another. Lionel could feel that these weren't real Rapaks he was facing. The only real Rapaks was the one whose corpse now hung in his segmented cube. Were nothing more than practice dummies set with the assumption that Lionel's group had the support of 6 individuals total. But Lionel wouldn't have it any other way. There was no better method than squeezing out every ounce of potential he had. Lionel flickered and vanished, his body appearing atop the Rapaks. With a strong punch downward, its head completely caved in. What once was an armor Lionel couldn't leave even the slightest scratch on lost all of its structural integrity beneath a single vicious blow, crushing the skull of the Rapax and shattering its brain. When Lionel appeared above the foggy lake once more, his gaze flickered, the vague image of a hidden rune dancing within his irises. He felt that he was faintly approaching his first watershed. His innate node thrummed with life, his body feeling as though it was alive. Lionel had come to realize that so long as he didn't actively call upon Scarlet Star Force and simply allowed his body to naturally regulate how much he could withstand, what could have been a lethal dose to anyone else became like a steroid pumping through his veins. This feeling is good. Lionel leapt forward, vanishing once more. The ire of his peers didn't make him waver in the slightest. In fact, he very much hoped that he would run into one of them very soon. He wanted to see what the geniuses of the human domain had to offer. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1319. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:44 and 24 seconds p.m. Chapter 1319. Roundhouse. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1319. Roundhouse. Lionel's hair fluttered, his body surrounded by powerful artistic conceptions. His star conception looked almost no different from his previous summer conception. However, the difference in its power was akin to night and day. Lionel had already set the path for his heavenly body realm comprehension after stepping foot into the core of the Milky Way Guild's disaster world. His summer construct was formed as the foundation of his star construct. His fall construct was the foundation of his moon construct. His winter construct became the foundation of his planet construct. And, finally, his spring construct became the foundation of his meteor construct. The summer construct spoke for itself. Radiant core was a dense mass of radiant force, a high radioactive-like fire elemental force. It had strong gravitational and magnetic properties, making it both good for defense and great for increasing Lionel's offensive output as well. Lionel often liked to use it as a core of his blade forces to form volatile drills. Lionel's fall construct was only used on occasion, but it was exceptionally powerful. It was dubbed a slow death by him. When he released its artistic conception, autumn leaves would fall from the skies in gorgeous colors ranging from bright orange to somber reds and browns. It had the effect of sucking away life force, matching with Lionel's winter construction, withering snowfall. Withering snowfall was a lot like a slow death, but rather than targeting the life force of people, it targeted their attacks. When in effect, it felt like the force in the area had dried up as ash fell from the skies like snowfall. If an autumn leaf of a slow death touched you, you would feel sluggish and slow. If an ashfall of withering snowfall touched your technique, its strength would plummet. Lionel didn't change the names of a slow death and withering snowfall, and now they worked together better than they ever had before. Lionel's planet construct became a ball of gorgeous white. Around it, moons of red, orange and brown rotated, their very presence making one feel as though they had aged a decade. The cycles of the moon made one feel as though time was passing at varying rates, distorting one's image of reality as though their mind had been cast into an odd illusion. At the same time, the pull of the planet could cause force to bend beneath its will, pushing and pulling, multiplying or eradicating. Together they were a perfect team, tugging on both reality and imaginary. Having evolved, a slow death now placed far more emphasis on slow, a lulling of the mind, a false sense of security, a pulling of wool over the eyes. Likewise, withering snowfall placed far more emphasis on withering now. Finally, there was golden drops, the conception of spring, and now Lionel's meteor construct. It was the most simple and straightforward. As spring, it released small droplets of golden rain, each as heavy as an anvil. And now, it released enormous rocks of golden fire, each as heavy as a small mountain. This chapter upload first at NovelBin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed subconsciously, Lionel's conceptions of destruction seeped into his heavenly body realm. It was impossible to avoid. His mind was wrapped into all things Scarlet Star Force. He hardly realized just how many stages he was blazing through without a care. He just wanted more. He couldn't seem to be satisfied, and he didn't seem to understand fatigue. He kept pushing and pushing relentlessly. He didn't even realize that his moon conception was becoming the most warped, evolving to something that stepped beyond what should have been possible for the heavenly body realm. It took Lionel 4 battles to grasp his meteor construct, 8 more to grasp his planet construct, and easily more than a dozen to grasp his moon construct. By the time he fused them all together, reaching the pinnacle and touching upon a state even among other true state comprehenders, He had already fought over 40 battles. Lionel improved by leaps and bounds with each. Even though the Raypaks he faced were supposed to be getting stronger, he seemed to improve even faster than they did. With every strike, his prowess increased by small percentage points. He became more acclimated to his own body, he learned more about his destruction conceptions, and he began to truly take advantage of his sharpened minds and the awakening of his soul. For the first time, Lionel was given challenge after challenge worthy of his talent level. Rather than being stuck in an organization filled with those who couldn't hope to match up to him, he was finally in a world where he couldn't just casually take step after step, and the result? Lionel's potential was dragged up piece after piece, bit after bit. It started like a trickle, but it eventually became an overwhelming tide, a tsunami that washed all those away. Even still at Tier 5, he faced a Tier 8 Raypax dauntlessly. He grabbed onto its throat, ripping its neck from its shoulder and feeling its final squeals vibrate his palms. When Lionel appeared again, there was no longer anywhere else to go. Bang. This time it wasn't a geyser. A platform crashed against his, fusing into a makeshift arena with lethal edges and a diameter of just over 20 meters. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com. To experience faster updates, speed up ahead. A group of geniuses shrouded in veils of gold met Lionel. There were just 3 of them, but each one carried their own air of haughtiness and pride. When they saw the violet gold sheen around Lionel, their gazes narrowed. That's him. The pathetic bastard who had his mommy get his token for high. Lionel's mind was still in battle mode. He hadn't even considered the idea that these people would want to exchange words. And even if they did, what did it have to do with him? His body seemed soaked in a bloody aura, a dense crimson fog fusing with his violet king's might. Bang. His fist crushed the ribcage of the man who had spoken. The sound of shattering bone and an upheaval of blood and vomit resounded as he was sent flying backward. His 2 teammates snapped out of their shock. They both reacted at the same time, rushing backward to save their group member before he fell off the edge and toward his death. But Lionel had followed closely behind. In a blink, his foot had appeared by the side of a young maiden's face in a perfect roundhouse kick. After fighting so many Raypaks, his mind had been infused with all sorts of perfect kicking forms and his body had adapted just as easily. Bang. His foot hooked across and downward, slamming her cheeks into the rugged stone platform and deforming her lovely features from 2 sides at once. If he had used any more strength, her entire head would have burst like a watermelon. The third and final teammate just barely managed to catch the first Lionel had sent flying before he was sent over into the lake below. However, when he looked back, all he could do was look on in shock. Oh, how was the gap so large? A steamy breath left Lionel's lips, the veins beneath his skin pulsing with a subtle red-gold color. Chapter 1320. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:44 and 23 seconds p.m. Chapter 1320. LS that all? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1320. LS that all? The third teammate's gaze turned steely. Regardless of the situation, he was still a genius in his own right, and the weight of a golden token wielder this year was far heavier than it had been in previous years. As far as he was concerned, they had underestimated Lionel, but they wouldn't continue to do so. Setting his teammate down, he immediately flipped his palms to reveal a twin pair of short sabers. With a step, his figure flickered and vanished, appearing before Lionel with a wind. It only took a glance for Lionel to pick out several things. A strong wind and dark elemental affinity, level 2 saber force, tier 9 strength, and what seemed to be either a lineage factor or ability index capable of making his presence fade. That matched with a top-level 5th-dimensional movement technique, and it felt like he had truly disappeared. Just this alone made the difference between these enemies and the ones Lionel had previously faced all too obvious. Just a random young man actually had so much talent. Lionel would often not run into an individual with even one of these talents, let alone all of them. The young man was right to be confident in himself. His blades flickered through the fog, jetting toward Lionel's throat like twin pincers, ready to sever his head from his shoulders. Bang. The young man suddenly found himself in a daze, his brain rattling in his skull and his jaw feeling like it might shatter as a strong upward pressure shot into it from below. It took him several moments for him to realize that Lionel's heel was blasting his head upward, his sabers just inches from the latter's neck and yet feeling like a world away. The young man couldn't wrap his head around how Lionel had grasped such impeccable timing. No, how had Lionel even been so fast? How had he been so confident? Lionel's legs formed a perfect split in the air, his heel driving up through the young man's jaw with such fierceness that the latter's feet lifted off the ground, sending him spiraling into the foggy skies like a rocket. The young man tried to reach out with the last reserves of his strength to close the final distance. But his efforts only made Lionel's gaze flicker. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Crack. The final bits of structural integrity the young man's jawline had left crumbled. A muffled cry tried to leave his lips but ended up dwarfed by a mouthful of shattered teeth and jawbone shards. Shoo. He spiraled into the air as Lionel slowly lowered his leg, the dense crimson around him and the subtle red gold of his veins becoming more prominent. With a dull thump, the young man fell back down to the ground, his body having shut down completely. And maybe for him this was for the best. The pain of having half your face shattered was most definitely not something anyone would want to be conscious for. Lionel released a breath, his chest moving at an even rhythm. He didn't even seem to have exerted himself, his breathing remaining unhurried and unbothered. Is this all? How boring. Lionel was disappointed. Maybe it was his mistake for still unleash everything. He hadn't even held back his ability index. In truth, as fast as Lionel was progressing, he still needed to find time to comprehend his ability index as well. Wise Star Order had told him that this was the only way to stop the restrictive ability Anarchic Force had on his Dream Force. But, at the same time, using his ability index made battles too easy. Lionel had progressed so fast that what had started as a challenge had become the same mundane nonsense he was used to. Was this really the pinnacle of the human domain? There had to be more, there had to be something waiting. The glowing cloaks of the three down-and-out geniuses rumbled before separating from their bodies. Soon they became floating orbs in the air. You can take them? Okay. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Lionel reached out, causing the three orbs to come toward him. Then, his flicked he wrist toward Aina and let her absorb all three. An audible crack resounded as the golden tokens of the three youths shattered. However, Aina's color still seemed to be gold without the slightest change. I see, so this is a choice. Those that go straight ahead have the best chance at dodging a forceful confrontation between geniuses. However, those that go right or left will eventually find themselves in a fight. You can either go straight and choose to keep the token you have or deviate and seek out something better. I already have an amethyst token, so I don't particularly need this. However, if I can raise Aina to an amethyst as well, it'll be a great advantage for the future. Plus, this is still a good opportunity to hone my combat prowess. From Lionel's understanding, only those who wielded golden tokens could immediately become quadrant-ranked disciples upon entering the Void Palace. Those without golden tokens would have to slowly prove themselves to rise above the nominal disciple rank. However, what no one had explained just yet was what the amethyst token could do. If Lionel was correct, the amethyst token just might represent a straight path toward the galaxy rank. Or, at the very least, you would get the chance to try. With this attempt, not only would a whole host of new resources be opened up, but it would also save Lionel many years as well. If he could bring Aina along with him and they could work together, the benefits would be exponentially greater. That way the two of them could forge a path for everyone else to follow behind. Having come to this conclusion, Lionel's gaze sharpened. Bang! A geyser erupted once again. But what was interesting was the fact that the path ahead didn't gain an explosion. In fact, the path the three youths had come from was still open. Interesting. The easy path, or? Lionel's feet were already moving as he jumped toward the mist left behind by the geyser. Chapter 1321. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:44 and 22 seconds p.m. Chapter 1321. Right hand. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1321. Right hand. Cornelius watched Lionel, his expression warping from time to time. 30%. He's gotten 30% stronger in a few hours. 40. 50. 80. Cornelius felt as though his head was spinning. A part of him wanted to believe that this wasn't improvement speed but rather just Lionel showing more of the strength he already had. But he felt like he knew better than to try and conclude such a thing. What was the most baffling was that he felt a change in Lionel after that fight. Those three. That young man is from the Sith family, the leading head of Shield Cross Star's stealth unit. He isn't the best among their current generation, but he's still within the top 5, he's even awakened the Sith lineage factor to such a level already. But Cornelius could feel it. Lionel got bored, and the instant he did, the rapid improvement that he was experiencing plummeted. It was as though Lionel could use his own mood to influence how fast his own progress could be. Cornelius had never heard of something like this before. Does he not have goals and aspirations? Does he not have something to strive for outside of what's right in front of him? If Lionel could hear Cornelius' thoughts, he would be baffled. Reason being, he definitely had a goal to strive after. He wouldn't be able to understand how or why Cornelius would come to such a conclusion. However, for any neutral outside observer, Cornelius' conclusion wasn't only sound, it was reasonable and felt like the truth. A person who had bought into their purpose, who truly strove after it with all they had, wouldn't be like Lionel. Why would something like boredom slow him down? Monotony was something anyone who wanted to succeed would have to learn to accept. Did that mean that Lionel didn't believe in his goal? Not necessarily. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net, if you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. If Cornelius knew of what Lionel wanted to accomplish, rather than feeling that it was all ridiculous, he might look toward Lionel more like he was looking at a monster rather than just a child he was looking after. There were only two real explanations for this. It was either Lionel didn't take his goal to conquer the dimensional verse as seriously as he claimed to. Lionel was so confident in his inevitable success that he felt no pressure whatsoever. Lionel knew that he was likely being observed, but he had already thrown such thoughts to the back of his mind, already focusing on his new goal. Now that he knew platforms didn't disappear and that paths formed by others could be used, he realized that this was a great opportunity. The more time passed, the more complicated the structure would become and the more chances there would be. There was a good chance that the more empty paths there were, the more geniuses would begin to travel along them. If Lionel ignored the easy paths to take, then others could take them. Eventually, the opponents Lionel needed would end up coming to him rather than him having to go and find them. Lionel could tell that this trial was built to allow this to happen. The more platforms were cleared, the more interconnectivity there would be, and the more likely it would be for two groups to run into each other. From the beginning, this was the design. Lionel was just making a decision that would allow this to happen faster. Rather than following paths that had already been cleared, he would forge new ones. As Lionel barreled forth, the day waned and Aina finally showed signs of waking up. When she finally did so, she realized that she lay on something as soft as clouds. It took her a moment before she registered the fact that it was a special ability of Blackstar's. She sat up slightly, Blackstar's twin tails allowing her all the room she needed to maneuver. Feeling the change, little Blackstar, who hovered in the forehead of his foggy construct, looked back. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net, if you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Yip. He excitedly greeted Aina, causing her to reveal a beautiful smile. Aina's gaze shifted toward Lionel's back. She knew that he was probably aware that she was awake already, but he was too focused on ripping apart the ray packs before him to pay attention to any of that. The defined muscles of his back, shoulders and lats rippled with veins and striations as he destroyed yet another foe. Aina took a deep breath, looking down at her hands. She felt much better. In fact, she felt better than she had in a long time. The anarchic force wasn't that much of an issue to her. After decades of dealing with a curse day in and day out, this felt like a light punishment. She had just needed to replenish her mind after draining it so completely. Even with how powerful her own mind was, Yuri was simply on a different level. Aina stretched, her curves displaying an enticing sight as she pulled her torso taut. Her figure was enticing to an extreme, her skin giving off a healthy color. She ran her hands through her hair, a light smile tugging at her pink lips. With a light push, she flipped through the air, landing like a feather on her feet. In a blink, she had appeared by Lionel's side, a delicate fragrance of apple and cinnamon following her every movement. Lionel's fist shot through the throat of the last Raypax, exhaling a light breath. He looked to the side as they vanished, appearing above the lake once more. His gaze met Aina's and he smiled lightly, his palm flipping over to hand her a familiar battle axe. Aina accepted it gracefully, resting the enormous 2-meter-long polearm on her shoulder as though it weighed nothing at all. Without a word exchanged, the two leapt to the next platform, little Blackstar following closely behind. Aina had come at the perfect time. The number of Raypacks they needed to face increased from just 1 to 2, and it would very likely increase from now on. Lionel let Aina take more of the lead, allowing her to get accustomed to fighting this new enemy. Subconsciously, Lionel knew that his biggest reliance in the journey ahead would be this woman by his side now. She was the only one among his current group with talent comparable to his, and he knew that this would be what it took to reach his goals. How could his right-hand woman not be able to cut down ray packs just as easily as he could? The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1322. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:44 and 20 seconds p.m. Chapter 1322. Perfect timing. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1322. Perfect timing. Aina adjusted quickly. Her battle sense had always been beyond Lionel's. What Lionel had to deduce and calculate she did as naturally as breathing, her instincts and reflexes existing on a plane all to her own. Facing the oppressive leg kicks of the Raypax, her movements were as calming as a spring's wind and as lithe as a ball of cotton. Lionel observed without a word, his mind entering a different sort of state. Now that he was out of his raging battle mode, he began to think about things in a new light. It was quite interesting. Of all the battle styles the Raypax could have with its powerful body, their race seemed to have chosen to become a group of kicking experts. One would never expect such a thing from their poor overall posture. But at the same time, Lionel had to admit that it suited them quite well. The claws on their feet had a lethality that spoke for themselves, their tails gave them an extra foundation to balance upon, giving them freedom of movement two-legged humans couldn't hope to match. They had an extra joint in their legs giving them added leverage for power, and as though all of these things weren't enough, their legs themselves were exceptionally long, taking up as much as 3/4 of their body. When things were broken down this way, it felt like it would be more of a shame than anything else if the Raypax chose any other martial art form. This chapter upload first at novelbin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Still, what fascinated Lionel wasn't the choice, but rather everything that facilitated its success. The Raypax could display strength far beyond their tier, all because of this choice of theirs. Lionel could imagine that their people had probably evolved a whole culture around their legs. Every technique, every lineage factor, and maybe even their ability indexes to a certain extent, were all streamlined to maximize this ability. Ability indexes were meant to be random and had nothing to do with genes and DNA. However, they had to come from somewhere. If Lionel was correct, then much like everything else, ability indexes were gifted and birthed from force. And just like Y-Star Order had said, the human domain was the only domain where the force was so widely variable and random. In that case, if the Raypax force distribution was so much more compact and streamlined, then wouldn't that also mean that the kind of ability indexes that could be bestowed upon their people also existed within a narrow margin? When things were looked at from this perspective, it all fell into place. Lionel hadn't noticed any obvious usage of an ability by the Raypax in the battles he had fought. But then again, he had only fought one real Raypax, while these Aina was facing now were nothing more than simulations. However, he had a feeling that even if they were real, the talents of the Raypax would all be so united in one pursuit that it wouldn't be easy even for him to tease apart their intricacies. So this is why the gap exists between humans and other races. We're so good at so many things that we've branched our evolutionary paths into more roads than could possibly be accounted for. If things are looked at in this way, even though my worldviews make the likes of the Brazinger family to be disgusting, maybe they have their reasons as well. Having such a thought made Lionel feel slimy, but it was the objective truth. The obsession of the Brazinger family over the purity of their bloodlines, even to the point of cursing a little girl to a lifetime of pain and suffering all as a warning, could be said to make sense if things were looked at through this light. When Lionel thought about it, everything about Aina's talents were perfect. Her ability index, her lineage factor, her style, her force affinities, they all combined into a single monstrous monolith. Now that he thought about it, the one other Brazinger family member that he had had in-depth contact with was also like this. Simeon's gene manipulation ability index was a lot like Aina's ability if you thought about it. If anything, Simeon's gene manipulation ability was just a more involved and controlled version of Aina's ability when extrapolated to an extreme. This chapter upload first at novelbin.net. Something that would make perfect sense since Aina was a half-blood while Simeon was, presumably, full-blooded. When Lionel reached this point in his thoughts, he felt his heart skip a beat. These were all things he had already known for a very long time, but when they were put together and described like this, it all made almost too much sense. But at the same time it was a reminder of his weakness. Lionel's talents worked together well enough, but it couldn't be said that they synergized and exponentially improved one another. However, if he truly wanted to reach the pinnacle of his strength, he would have to find a way. Lionel's gaze became serious. When I return to Earth, I won't let Simeon go again. His gene manipulation ability isn't even documented in any ability index I've ever read. In fact, I haven't ever seen Aina's ability documented either. But it also happens to be the perfect last piece to what the tentacle womb is missing, Lionel's mind word. He had created his dream path ability to help his brothers maximize their training regimens, taking inspiration from Aina's ability. It seemed that he would need to adjust it. Not only would he need to focus on maximizing their training, but he would also need to fuse all their talents toward a single path and battle style. Only like this would they become the absolute strongest versions of themselves. But first, I need to figure out how to do this for myself. I've already decided that my foundation will be my Scarlet Star Force and my comprehension of it is progressing smoothly. I need more data to complete the dream simulations for my future path, though. Lionel suddenly looked up as they vanished from the foggy world. Perfect timing. Up ahead, a group led by a young woman with a poisonous sort of air appeared to their left. Chapter 1323. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:44 and 18 seconds p.m. Chapter 1323, Good Thing. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1323 Good Thing. Lionel knew that he was getting ahead of himself. He couldn't complete this new streamlined battle style with the limited knowledge he had now. Only after seeing all the resources the Void Palace had on hand could he make an informed decision. But, in the meanwhile, gathering data and ensuring Aina gained an amethyst token was his top priority. When the group across from them realized that they were facing Lionel, their gazes narrowed. But it wasn't just this, they could tell that Aina's cloak of gold was also a brighter and more vibrant sheen than usual as well. It was clear that this group had defeated others before reaching this point. There was no doubt that information about Lionel had already been spread. In fact, it could be said that it was because of Lionel that the battle to the center of the lake had become as violent as it had. The idea of fighting through many golden token wielders, a large segment of whom would have been amethyst token wielders any other year, was like asking for death. Most would have chosen to cut their losses and focus on reaching the main objective rather than chasing after side quests. However, Lionel had become a juicy piece of meat dangling over all of their noses. Rather than defeating a whole host of golden token wielders, all you would have to do is defeat a single fake amethyst token holder and you would be promoted in a single bound. That sort of enticement and luck of the draw lottery was on a completely different level. And as a result there were many more participants. All of this said, there were many groups who would have chosen to participate regardless, groups that had full and unbridled confidence in themselves. And this group, from a very familiar golden sector, was one of them. The young mistress of the pious family, Simona, almost seemed to glide as she walked, her dainty feet only barely peeking out beneath her long dark purple gown from time to time. It truly seemed as though she was walking on air rather than solid ground, her gait too smooth for words. Her hips swayed like a hypnotic pendulum, her skin so pale that one might feel as though you just might be able to see right through it. However, she contrasted her near-transparent skin with bold dark purple lipstick and long curved nails, decorated with gems and a base coat of the very same color. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Her hair was once again a dark shade of purple. The only slightly lighter sheen to be found were in her pair of irises, steady with an undying cold light. Despite the darkness she exuded, she was truly a beauty beyond words, a gorgeous woman with a delicate nose and gently sloping chin that lost out to Aina in no way. Her slender waist swayed just once more before she came to a stop, her subordinates following suit without a word as well. At that moment, a slender little pinkish-purple fox with the stature of a puppy peeked out from Simona's leg, its large black eyes blinking curiously as it observed little Black Star. Lionel took all of this in without a word. The pressure he felt from this woman was no joke. Compared to the three he had defeated previously, she was on a completely different level. The dangerous light in her cold eyes spoke for itself even while not saying a thing. Lionel had known that he might run into such a character taking the approach he had. But he had left it up to fate. It seemed that his luck wasn't very good. And yet, some of that bubbling excitement seemed to want to resurface. Unfortunately, as soon as that excitement came back, he felt a heated gaze boring 2 holes into his cheek. Eventually he sighed. Fine. She's yours. I'll handle the rest of them. Lionel had almost forgotten that Aina was even more of a battle maniac than maybe even he was. Toward his words she smiled sweetly, her visage seeming to disperse the fog like a ray of sun. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. You have to take care of your image, Aina said lightly. What would it look like if a king was always fighting women? Lionel's lip twitched. Fighting women? What was wrong with that? There was probably a young woman right about now, whose face was still half buried in dirt and stone, who was lamenting the fact Aina didn't wake up earlier. Aina giggled seeing Lionel's reaction. She knew well that he never cared about such things. On Earth he gave women their due as the fairer sex. However, after the metamorphosis, there was nothing fairer about women. With how Lionel broke everything down logically, he saw no reason to not treat women as his equals any longer. But this was exactly why she was here. There were some things that couldn't always be dictated by logic. Aina had already decided to do something about Lionel's choice of wardrobe when next she got the chance. He was too handsome to be wasting it all on sweatpants. Aina took a step forward, her smiling expression vanishing. Her battle axe rested on her shoulder, her long jet black hair dancing about in the wind. She looked particularly wild, the short beast-skin skirt and choker she wore playing on the fantasies of all who saw her. But after seeing how she interacted with Lionel, they were under no illusions about where her allegiances lay. Simona's cold gaze didn't waver. Instead, she only shifted it from Aina to Lionel. "I don't fight the weak. Just hand over your tokens and scram. I have no interest in wasting time on unworthy scum." Her voice came out the same biting cold her image shared, her indifference washing over Aina. However, Lionel only grinned. "Good thing she's not weak. Unfortunately for you, she's especially not weak when she's angry. Good luck." Aina's entire demeanor shifted, a dense fog of red erupting around her as her axe force pierced into the skies. Important announcement below. Smiley face. Chapter 1324. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:44 and 16 seconds p.m. Chapter 1324. Useless if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1324. Useless. Simona's pupils constricted. The instant Aina moved, it was as though the weight of an expert bore down from all sides. Her powerful thighs grew a size, her toned torso flexed, her slender arms pulsed with a power their slight frame had no business having. Every movement was efficient to an extreme and refined to the final detail. She was a work of art. Simona's expression calmed, her arms leaving their relaxed position and her hands raising. The long, painted nails that graced them curled like claws, shimmering with delicately designed gems. Her arms swept at the air even as Aina's axe swung downward. Bang! Claw and blade met. On one side, a dark violet gown danced wildly in the wind, and on the other, a long cascading river of jet black hair flowed as though a single cohesive whole. Sparks flew between them, neither woman taking even a single step backward. Simona's arm trembled, her gaze narrowing further. In that instant, what looked like a stalemate collapsed. Bang! The ground beneath her feet shattered, her dress threatening to fly from her body out from below as though a strong air current had assaulted her ankles. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Aina's strength with had been equal to Simona's suddenly erupted past her, forcing Simona to quickly retreat lest she be forced into the ground. As Simona fell backward, her delicate and seemingly dainty feet left deep craters in the ground, the little puppy that had been dancing around her ankles quickly dodging out of the way to avoid being crushed into minced meat. Simona's gaze flickered as Lionel's lip twitched. Well, he had given Simona a warning. It wasn't his fault that she hadn't listened. But then again, by the time he had given said warning, it was probably already too late for his advice to be heeded. There was no doubt in Lionel's mind that Aina had done it on purpose. Her control over her body was so finely tuned that she had put out only just enough strength to negate Simona's own counter in that instant. Then, when Simona was feeling confident that their strengths were about equal after a single probe, Aina erupted with more strength in a position that wasn't conducive to gathering momentum in the first place. The difference was clear. Simona had come into the exchange with intent to probe. Aina had entered the exchange with intent to humiliate. And the only way you could get away with such a thing is if you had the confidence and the arrogance to do so. Simona's gaze turned a shade colder, her final stomp stopping what was left her momentum just before reaching the edge of the platform. Simona wasn't very put off by this result. Physical strength was clearly Aina's strong suit, but it wasn't even something Simona would list in her top 3 best qualities. However, it was clear that Aina was aware of this as well, or else she wouldn't have taken such an approach. Aina could have forced her back immediately, but she hadn't chosen to do this. Instead, she had thrown down an obvious gauntlet. She didn't just plan to win this battle, she planned to cruise to its ends. She didn't just plan on winning, she planned on doing so handily. The cold light in Simona's gaze grew, a fog of dark violet force beginning to spread around her. The expressions of her subordinates changed, their hearts skipping a beat. They could tell that their young miss was enraged. Despite the fact her expression didn't seem to have changed in the slightest, the bloodthirst in her air now was heavier than the air itself. "I would put the poison away if I were you," Aina said lightly. "Unless you're seeking to be humiliated again, that is." Simona didn't say a single word. Her right palm flipped over to reveal a snaking black with dense scale-like patterns that made it seem as though it had been carved out of the hide of a dragon. Her left palm flipped over to reveal a slender silver blade that seemed a bit too long to be considered a knife or dagger, but still a hint too short to be considered a sword or short sword. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. This odd dual-wielding style was a specialty of the Pious family. A tail-like whip and a stinger-like sword. Together they formed a lethal combination of long and short range. The moment they appeared, two strong level 2 blade-like forces manifested. With a single step, Simona's gown tore a gash from its hem to her hip, revealing a gorgeous sight of supple calf and thigh. A garter pressed against her pale flesh, lined with slender silver needles that emitted an air of lethality. As Simona raised her leg to take a second step, both women vanished. A whip lashed out through the air only to be deflected by a punch. A short sword split the wind in two, only to have its blade force shattered by an axe. A flurry of exchanges erupted, the glow in Aina's golden irises becoming more prominent and the coldness in Simona's own becoming deeper. The more blows they exchanged, the denser the dark violet fog seemed to become. The rolling waves plucked on the strings of the wind, gliding along with them and resonating as one. The moment this dark violet fog entered Lionel's range, he could feel his destruction characteristic eating at it alive. But he could also sense the dark violet fog trying to fight back to no avail. Bang. 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 "I've told you. It's useless." Aina's figure flickered. Her ample chest grew a size and her cherry lips parted. Under the astonished gazes of all those watching their battle, she took in a strong breath, suddenly causing all the force in the surroundings to be pulled into her body. Lionel's brows shot up, but his shock was nothing compared to Simona's. The latter quickly blocked her chest but found herself stumbling backward hard, her small feet once again leaving dense trenches in the ground. Simona's gaze flickered, her palm flipping over to put her sword away just in time for her to reach for her thighs and throw out 3 needles at once. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1325. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:44 and 15 seconds p.m. Chapter 1325. Disparity. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1325. Disparity. The needles whistled through the air with a strength that could match the rapax. The strong currents of wind it should have produced were split in two beneath their fine construction. Beneath the low light, they almost seemed to fuse into the fog, their bodies carrying with them a hint of devastating pressure. Even without this odd poisonous force, these needles were lethal. But, with them, it was enough to make far greater men feel inferior. Aina took a strong step forward, her hair fluttering. She released a hand from her battle axe and her palms swiped through the air with an elegant flair. Her every action was filled with confidence. In that moment, it felt like even though Simona and Aina could be considered comparable in beauty, when it came to innate disposition, the latter was in a class all to her own. As though the needles were nothing special at all, Aina caught the first between her fore and middle finger, the second between her middle and ring finger, and the last between her ring and pinky finger. Her arms swept through the air in a clear arc, not pausing for even a moment. The only sign of her action was a dull slapping sound as each one was trapped between her slender digits. Without missing a beat, Aina continued to move forward, her momentum not having stalled even a single measure. She didn't even seem to notice the dense purple force around her fingers at all, as though it could do nothing more than tickle her. Simona's eyes widened. She hadn't planned for her needles to harm or injure Aina, but she had banked on them stalling her opponent for just a moment. Catching them out of the air like that was completely beyond her expectations. It required a level of skill, speed and coordination that she could hardly wrap her head around, especially when the force she had coated it in was taken into consideration. Just a single mistake would have ended in iron being skewered. Unfortunately for her, Simona hardly got the change to finish this thought before Aina's hand whipped forward once more. This time the needles were sent flying again, but they felt almost twice as fast. Just a flick of Aina's wrist carried more strength than most could even begin to fathom behind it. Simona, who was still off balance, quickly brandished her short, silver sword, realizing that there was no other choice to make. Ding, ding, ding. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Simona's wrist went numb, her shoulder quaking as she was forced several steps back once again. But by then, even as she teetered on the edge of the platform, Aina had already appeared before her, her battle axe swinging downward once again. Aina's battle style was ruthless and to the point. She wasted no movements and seemed to make moves on instinct that cornered her enemy step by step. From the psychological assault that started the battle to the oppressive physical might that seemed to be about to end it, she had been absolutely perfect and without blemish. It almost made Simona look as though she was truly not worth much of anything despite the fact she was a true genius. Young Miss. The other younger generation members of the pious family couldn't remain standing no more. They had felt Simona's rage and knew better than to interfere. But now that things reached this point, even if their young miss became enraged, they couldn't just allow her to die. No one knew what was hidden within the foggy lake below, but considering the circumstances, it didn't take a genius to understand that it wasn't good. However, wasn't Lionel still here? Lionel had been observing everything intently from the very beginning. Despite being impressed with the battle, he wouldn't lag behind in intervening when the matter became like this. His figure flickered, his body appearing amidst the encirclement of pious family members. There were exactly 4 of them, each carrying a demeanor similar to Simona's. It was as though this entire family was suffused with an air of hardly disguised coldness. Their gazes only became colder when they saw Lionel. However, the latter only smiled, facing their attacks with a calmness. "You're strong," Lionel thought to himself. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. Lionel pressed 2 palms outward, slapping the forearm of a fist aimed for his head. Taking advantage of the shift in momentum, he threw a solid punch at their lats. He could feel a satisfying deformation of flesh and bone when his fist connected, but it only lasted a moment before this individual was blown away. At that same moment, Aina's blade descended upon Simona. Bang! Simona found herself thrust into the ground, the back of her head and even her back itself crushed into the stone beneath them. The only thing between herself and being sliced into was her blocking short sword, her entire body being pressed into the ground. A deep humiliation flickered within Simona's gaze. She could feel that the gap between her and Aina shouldn't feel this large, and yet, here they were. The sound of muffled groans resounded as Simona's people were further blasted away, their bodies unable to keep up with Lionel's strikes and counters. It felt as though he was twice as fast, twice as strong and twice as capable as any one of them. "Your golden token," Aina said lightly. Simona's blade trembled against Aina's axe while the latter's blade might as well have been as steady as a mountain. The disparity in raw strength couldn't have been more obvious. If Aina wanted to press down and kill her, she could do so only by adding a little bit more strength just as she had done before. Simona's cold gaze flickered. But, without a word, she brought out her token. Under a mysterious law, it cracked, its color flowing into Aina. Lionel smiled, standing over the 4 defeated subordinates. This had gone even smoother than expected. But Lionel maybe should have known that things couldn't possibly stay so easy for him. Chapter 1326. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:44 and 14 seconds p.m. Chapter 1326. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1326. It could be said that the pious family was simply unlucky to have run into Lionel and Aina of all people. If there were any 2 that could be considered perfect counters to their strongest points, it was most definitely this pair. The pious family used a special force known as pious force, which was known for its poisonous and corrosive attributes. Any member of this family would have spent most of their time learning how to master and control this force due to the danger that it presented not just to everyone around them, but namely even they themselves. As a result of this, the younger the pious family member was, the more likely it was that the main tenet of their battle prowess would be their usage of pious force. Under normal circumstances, this was still enough for them to display strength beyond the imaginations of most. Pious force was capable of many things. It could corrode force, its thickness could push force it couldn't corrode away, forming a domain where the only force that could exist in a region was itself. It could infect a target, weakening their senses and slowing their reflexes. The list felt endless, and even this much was just the tip of the iceberg. If a wielder of this force wanted, they could even attack one's internal sight, corroding the mind and soul after a certain point. With the support of such a powerful force, the strength of its wielder would be undeniable. However, without it, Simona had lost as much as 90% of her true combat prowess. Unfortunately for her, Lionel's passive destruction cloak, a name he had decided to give his current state, destroyed practically everything in its path. Scarlet Star Force was an innately higher form of force than Pious Force and, as a result, had no single problem suppressing it. On the other end, Aina was immune to poisons thanks to her ability. Her self-healing was on a level far beyond the healing factor given to Lionel by his Snowy Star Owl lineage factor. In her current state, even if Aina wanted to regrow an arm, she could do so. This was how far her ability index had progressed. Aina retracted her axe even as another geyser rose into the air. 4 more streams of gold entered her body and the resplendent light that coated her rose to an all-new level. It seemed like it was right on the verge of evolving to a new tier. Maybe only 1 or 2 more golden tokens would be necessary for Aina to earn an amethyst token. Then, Lionel smiled. "Alright, let's go." He leapt toward a new platform, Aina following close behind. A dull silence was left in their wake. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Simona didn't move for a long while. She knew why it was she had lost, but that didn't mean she accepted it. She wasn't the type of person to make excuses. There were many races on the void battlefield that had methods of immunizing themselves against her poison. It was her job to surpass these limitations and rise above it. Her guardians had long since told her that she had reached the threshold of mastery in Pious Force to move on to improving her battle prowess in other ways. However, Simona had been stubborn. She didn't just want to meet a minimum threshold, she wanted to be like her ancestors and bestow the family with an evolution, a step beyond what they had now. Due to this, despite the fact she could have begun to train up herself in other ways, she remained entirely focused on Pious Force. Of course, when she met those that couldn't counter her, she was unstoppable, being a genius no weaker than any of the top echelon of this generation. However, when she ran into someone like Aina, she felt like nothing more than cannon fodder. Simona slowly rose to her feet, not bothering to wipe the blood that trickled down her lovely violet-painted lips. The dot of crimson was especially striking upon her pale features and her expression gave way to no emotion. She strolled forward, whip in one hand, sword in the other. A murderous aura surrounded her. She was going golden token hunting. One day she would pay back this defeat. "Ha! It's a good chance," was Aina's only response. Lionel was speechless. They had only just left their battle with Simona when Aina said that this was a good opportunity for Lionel to recruit her. Lionel almost felt like someone was pulling a prank on him and had unearthed some hidden cameras in a few seconds. But, when Aina confirmed that she was serious, he really had no idea what to say. "Why do you think I fought her instead of letting you do it?" This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Wasn't that because she was a woman? She had said so herself. The fact she was a woman is part of the reason, yes. But I could also tell that she used poisons. It was obvious from the very beginning that would be able to defeat her easily. I have a certain sensitivity to that sort of stuff. And because she's easy to defeat? Because she'd be easy to defeat despite being such a great talent, in the event that she did lose, the resentment she held would be toward whoever defeated her, meaning me. She'll train, improve herself and likely challenge me again. But she will still lose. When this happens continuously, and yet she realizes that I follow you, she'll birth an innate respect for you that exists outside of whatever resentment she has for me. In fact, after losing to me continuously, she might even try to find a different method of defeating me that just might include being more useful to you than I can be. Lionel's expression flickered. When this woman becomes so scheming? It didn't really seem like her at all. But, soon, Lionel would come to understand where this came from. She seems like a person far too prideful to take that sort of path, though. You don't understand. Aina shook her head. The pride of a man is different from the pride of a woman. They don't manifest in the same ways. Plus, there are certain things that only I can do for you. Recruiting talented women is one of those things. Your status is special. If you go around recruiting women as the future heir of the Morales family, people will misunderstand. That's why these sort of tactics are better. Why did it sound like she was just keeping tabs on the women around him? Lionel was about to respond when he frowned. Already? He could see it up ahead. The center of the lake was already in view and many groups had already surrounded it. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1327. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:44 and 13 seconds p.m. Chapter 1327. Interesting. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1327. Interesting. Several platforms hovered in a circle around the center of the lake. It was clear by the lack of variety in the paths taken to get here that many had still made the opposite choice to Lionel, instead choosing to forge their way to the center as quickly as possible. Lionel immediately felt that this was a great opportunity. Those with the least stone pathways were likely among those who believed in their abilities the least and were, as such, easier targets. Aina was only a step or two away from wielding an amethyst token. However, Lionel suddenly thought of another possibility that made him frown. I went out of my way to always choose the more difficult path, and yet we somehow only ran into two groups with just enough golden tokens to place Aina on the brink of earning the next grade? Was that by coincidence? Or by design? Lionel's gaze narrowed. With how important the amethyst token was to the Void Palace, would they really allow one to so easily upgrade to it? What if these pathways had purposely led Lionel and Aina here after it deduced that they were close to a breakthrough? That lends itself to more questions than answers though. There has to be a path toward reaching the amethyst stage. But why would it be here? The Void Palace must know that it might be even easier to gain what tokens were missing here compared to elsewhere. Unless... Lionel suddenly realized something quite obvious. There was no easy path to reach anyone here. Though they were all concentrated into a circle, the space between each platform was enormous. The circumference covered at least a few kilometers, but there were only a few dozen platforms and groups. There was no simple way to challenge them unless Lionel just flew over. But something told Lionel that there was a reason they were so spaced out. If he tried to close the distance, he would definitely end up blocked. So we aren't given an opportunity to reach the amethyst rank and we can't challenge people anymore. What exactly is the point of this, then? This chapter upload first at novelbin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. At that moment, another platform appeared within the circle and soon another. Lionel's gaze locked onto a golden pair of irises, his eyes not shifting away. The appearance of Conan seemed to make the atmosphere several times heavier. Before this trial began, Lionel had noticed this young man before. But after the geysers started erupting and platforms started appearing, the phenomena caused the fogginess of the lake to increase manifold. The result was a clear line of sight vanishing for them all until they reached this proximity. Seeing the young man again, and at a much closer distance, Lionel could feel the hairs on his skin tingling, his body threatening to re-enter that state once again. It was the same feeling he had gotten from Simona, except multiplied several times over. Much of Simona's lethality was concentrated in her pious force, something that didn't give Lionel any pressure at all. His feeling when meeting her was more like an acknowledgement of her strength rather than an acknowledgement of the threat she might pose. But this young man, he was different. Lionel could feel something not too dissimilar from his king's might coming from Conan. Not just that, but he felt something quite similar to Aina's berserk god lineage factor as well. He and those that followed him had wild, unrestrained auras. But they also had a lofty, imperial sort of arrogance as well. Just being in their presence felt stifling. At that moment, Lionel smiled, an action that made Conan, who only wanted for murder, feel taken aback. He couldn't wrap his head around why this bastard was smiling at him. Is that son of a bitch taunting me? Unfortunately, Conan wouldn't get his answer, at least not immediately. After smiling, Lionel looked away and sat down cross-legged, taking a deep breath. Little Blackstar vanquished his wolf construct and hopped into Aina's arms as she took a seat as well. It was clear that whatever it was that was about to happen here, it wouldn't be occurring right this moment. This chapter upload first at novelbin.net. Lionel took a deep breath, his breathing even and his mind focused. He had felt like he was on the precipice of a breakthrough not long ago. But after his bloodthirstiness for battle vanished, it had slipped away as well. Lionel always had at least a few of his minds reading and recording what was happening to his body at any moment. Whether it was his mindset, the changes to his biochemistry, and most definitely something as important as a failed breakthrough, he kept tags on them all. Whenever he settled down, he could review these moments with absolute clarity. This was the power of the Tier 4 control stage of Lionel's ability index. When he reached a certain level of mastery, he would even be able to replay the state his body had been in during a failed breakthrough and make some minor tweaks to ensure that he succeeded this time. Interesting, so that's what happened. From what Lionel could see, an odd and special sort of rune had tried to form but failed to in the end because it lacked appropriate stimulus. This rune seemed to have wanted to take root in Lionel's force nodal and their pathways, fusing together with his internal force and influencing his every attack. It needs me in a state where I'm wanting for blood and battle. This makes sense considering what Y Star Order told me about the disposition of Scarlet Star Force. These runes are probably the key to fully comprehending my innate node and likely represent fundamental portions of the natural force nodes hidden within it. These natural force nodes had been able to protect Lionel from such a large concentration of anarchic force. They weren't a joke by any stretch of the imagination. Lionel's eyes opened, his gaze sweeping over his potential opponents. They would be the whetstone he needed to cross this final barrier. At that moment, another platform appeared and Lionel's smile became wider. It seemed Conan wasn't the only one who could make his heart race. A hulking man standing at 2.5 meters tall appeared, his legs dangling from the edge of his platform and a twin pair of enormous battle axes pierced into its sides. Important announcement below. More chapters coming. Chapter 1328. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:44 and 11 seconds p.m. Chapter 1328. One task: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1328. One task: the broad chest of the young man was completely exposed, rippling with strength and muscles that could have fit right in with the sheer cliff. His bottom half was covered in tight black legging that sunk into every crevice, peak and valley of his monstrous quads, and the only other accessory on his body was a fur-covered belt that seemed to double as a spatial device. Unfortunately, this fashion choice but this overly large young man placed the outline of a set of family jewels and their crowning achievement on far too great a display. But it was either this young man hadn't noticed the provocativeness of his style of dress, or he simply didn't care. This young man was none other than the third individual Conan Leo had mentioned during his tirade, Armand of the Terrius family. He indeed didn't care about this appearance, nor was he trying to be provocative. Much like Lionel, he was only concerned with being as comfortable as possible. If it was up to him, he would be completely naked as he walked about and interacted with the world. But his father had berated him one too many times about such a thing, some nonsense about how they were already seen as brutish enough without him confirming stereotypes, so he could only compromise in this way. Of course, the patriarch of the Terrius family was still infuriated by his son's choices. But at this point, it was already much too late to do anything about his disposition. What was done was done. At least his future daughter-in-law would see what she was working with before she married into their family. Clearly, the father was just as brazen and brutish as the son, or else he would have never had such a thought to begin with. Armand's feet swung back and forth on the edge of platform, stretching and yawning from time to time. He seemed a bit disappointed with the view, but there wasn't much even he could do about the fog. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Armand looked up and matched Lionel's gaze almost the instant the latter locked eyes with him. His head titled to the side, his muscles involuntarily rippling of their own accord. He didn't even notice Lionel's violet gold cloak until several moments had passed. Oh. Everything about Armand just a moment before, if one disregarded his size, was entirely innocent. He swung his feet, he calmly observed his surroundings, and he looked like a bit of an airhead one might want to protect. However, the moment he laid eyes on Lionel, his demeanor seemed to shift entirely. His gaze didn't become cold, nor did he release some fiendish or violent aura. Rather, his irises gained a glossy sort of look to them as his tilted head slowly straightened. His heartbeat slowed to a crawl, his skin slightly tensed and reddened, and everything around him seemed to grind to a halt as though force itself was too scared to move. Lionel's own gaze narrowed. This look, it reminded him of something. His mind was sent into a dry prairie land with tall grasslands of brown and yellow. In the distance, a lion slowly stalked its prey, its reflective irises peeking through the strands of grass and fusing with the land. There was no rage in its eyes, no anticipation, no killing intent. Its emotions were impossible to read, but even as your own legs quaked, even as your knees weakened and cold sweat poured down your back, it simply continued to slowly stalk forward, its four limbs gently gliding from one to another, its path connected to you by an invisible tether. You probably knew that you should run, but you knew that you would be too slow. You thought that maybe you should fight, but you knew that you would be too weak. You might scramble and hope to distract it or give it a meal that was more enticing, but you could see that it only had eyes for your warm flesh. That glassy look in Armand's eyes was no different. His twin axes, each with blades half the size of his enormous body, released a slight aura, a blackish sort of force that made the temperature plummet. Lionel could feel his blood run cold. It wasn't completely out of his control. The weakness of his snowy star owl lineage factor seemed to manifest in full force now, meeting a creature that stood so far above itself. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. In that moment, Lionel's quiet observation warped, his brows furrowing and a deep pit of disgust deepening within his belly. He hadn't been in a rush to meditate upon the bronze tablet to improve his lineage factor before, mostly because he simply hadn't had the time yet. By the time he had recovered enough to train, they had already delayed the Void Palace enough and had to leave. But this feeling almost made him want to vomit. Right then, a burning sensation raced through Lionel's veins. A strong force threatened to incinerate his blood to ash. Aina frowned, looking toward Lionel. She could tell that something was off, but she wasn't a mind reader. It was difficult to pinpoint exactly what the problem was. Lionel closed his eyes, taking deep breaths. He forcefully suppressed the feeling. He would just end up harming himself if he acted on impulse. But he had already decided he would definitely purge himself of this lineage factor. That said, he would first use this so-called weak lineage factor to put Armand in his place. He had been thoroughly provoked. Armand had no way of reading Lionel's thoughts. All he felt was a weak creature cowering away. He lost any interest he had had. At this point he felt the only thing interesting about Lionel was his amethyst token. He would definitely be leaving here with it in his hands. At that moment the platforms rumbled, beams of light suddenly jetting out and connecting them all. In those final moments, what was presumably the last platform had appeared to trigger all of this, and it was unsurprisingly Simona who had managed to make it back. You only have one task: survive and make it back to safety. The rumbling voice of a woman cast over them all. And then they all disappeared. This year would indeed be different. Up until now, nothing too out of the norm had occurred. But now, the true dark nature of what it meant to be a protector of humanity would show. Chapter 1329. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:44 and 10 seconds p.m. Chapter 1329. Foul odor. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1329. Foul odor. Alarms went off in Lionel's mind. Without the slightest hesitation, he reached outward and grabbed onto little Blackstar tight. At the same time he used his other arm to wrap around Aina's waist. A strong king's might erupted from him like a pillar piercing through the skies. He held back nothing as he enveloped all three of them just before his vision went completely black. Lionel's head swam, however he only allowed it to do so for a brief moment before he activated Dream Sense. What? Lionel's heart froze, his blood running cold. He tried to use Dream Sense again, but it failed once more just like it had the first time. The realization made him remember a particular conversation he had had with Wise Star Order, and his brows immediately furrowed. Taking a deep breath, Lionel dug deep. He had managed to make a faint connection with his soul and it could be considered to be partially awakened. However, he couldn't use his own nearly as freely as Wise Star Order could, and he even somewhat avoided using anything other than its passive strengthening upon being accessed. Now though, Lionel felt that waking up his mind was far more important than anything else. Lionel's soul became like an anchor, stabilizing his mind and his senses. Everything slowly snapped back into place. First, his proprioception came back and he could feel his limbs in space once again. He could tell that his grip on Aina and Blackstar were still there even though he couldn't feel them. Then came his sense of smell, but he almost immediately recoiled. The air smelt like hot sulfur and rotten boiled eggs. He almost immediately began to hack and wheeze, or at the very least he thought he did. It was still hard to sense much of anything. He could just barely make out the shaking of his head. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Finally, his sense of touch came back and he could confirm that he did indeed still have Blackstar and Aina by his side. Both were absolutely still and unmoving. Once these senses settled in, Lionel's eyesight finally came back. But what he saw made him narrow his eyes once again. Unfortunately, this was less due to the shocking realization about where he was and had much more to do with the fact it was as hard to keep his eyes open as it was to breathe through his nose. As bad as the smell was, his eyes felt as though someone had been continuously cutting onions in the surroundings. The irritation was so bad that Lionel was legitimately worried he might lose his eyesight if he kept them open too wide. Lionel, Aina and little Blackstar were actually at the bottom of a tall pit. Up above, there was a hole to the sky and the air current of this pit all seemed to be converging toward this location to be filtered upward. Looking around, Lionel realized that this wasn't actually a pit but was actually a lot like a hive with deeply interconnected tunnels, all with exits a lot like this one. The hole to the sky didn't seem to have any simple way to be used, and even the closest edge of the hole was 300 meters above his head. Lionel couldn't even dream of jumping that distance, especially since the gravity here is so heavy, even compared to the Void Palace, which was difficult to deal with in and of itself. This place was at least double that. But Lionel quickly shook his head. There was no guarantee that this wasn't the Void Palace. But my ability? Lionel shook his head. There was no point in speculating until he found out more information. The goal here was clear: to survive and reach a certain destination. To do such a thing, he couldn't speculate, he needed facts. Allowing a bias to color his deductions would just make finding the truth slower. Lionel released Aina, observing her intently. He didn't need to worry too greatly, though. In just a few seconds she seemed to have regained her bearings as well. The first thing she did, not much unlike Lionel, was look around, covering her nose with her hands. "This is a nest," she suddenly said. "The smell. Though it's disgusting, it's coming from something that's highly nutritious, albeit disgusting to eat." Lionel's brows shot up. With Aina's ability, she had a keen sense for nutrition. Not only was she able to naturally tell how best to train her body, but she also knew exactly how to concoct the sort of nutrients she needed to supplement her body as well. This was what made her natural talent as a force pill crafter so high, and why she had been so greatly valued by Valiant Heart Mountain. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net the fact that her ability could be used like this was still a bit of a surprise to Lionel. Maybe this mutation of hers as a half-blood wasn't as inferior as Lionel had previously concluded. Lionel couldn't take out the dictionary in this place. The anarchic force in this region even higher than it had been beyond the walls of Village 0012, it was to the point that even Lionel's ability was no longer at Tier 4 in this place. "Do you know what it's a nest of?" Lionel asked. "No, I'm not sure. I only vaguely have the instinct that it's an egg." Lionel nodded. There didn't seem to be any immediate danger in the surroundings. However, Lionel knew this couldn't possibly last long. He had felt the teleportation try and separate himself and Aina. If not for his quick action, they would have been thrown apart. That told Lionel that there was no more hand-holding and teaming up designed for this trial. They had truly thrown them off the deep end. But likewise, because they had chosen to do this, it was likely that the elders were aware that the danger wouldn't be immediate either. "Why, Star Order, what do you know about this place?" "It is indeed a nest. If I were you, I would probably start running. There's no way they haven't already sensed such a mass teleportation. And the ones assigned to guard nests like these are nothing like those middling soldiers you've been fighting until this point." Almost as though to confirm why Star Order's words, a wild scream resonated through the hive, following the air currents of rushing foul smells and making Lionel feel almost as though his eardrums might burst. The howl was like a furious battle cry and a sonorous warning, echoing all before the earth began to quake. Lionel's pupils constricted, his jaw steeling and his lips being drawn into a thin line. The Void Palace sure seemed to like to play games. They had actually been teleported into a Raypack's nest. Oh, I forgot to mention one other thing. The Raypacks like to build their nests in harsh environments so that only the strong amongst their young survive. You've probably guessed it already, but this is a Void battlefield. Trying to leave here and return to a Void Palace stronghold won't be easy for a fairly simple reason. The Raypacks are probably the least of your concerns in a place like this. Chapter 1330. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:44 and 8 seconds p.m. Chapter 1330. Senate. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1330. Senate, we need to move. Aina nodded toward Lionel's words and they both shot in the opposite direction of the roar. Neither of them were fools. The pressure of that roar alone cleared the fifth dimension. That told them one very obvious thing: this wasn't a perfectly curated trial with their limits in mind. This was a real life and death crisis. What Aina, Lionel and the other youths didn't know was that this sudden change had led to a furious uproar in the Void Palace. Bang! Who sanctioned this? The roar shook the mountain range, birds flew out in fear and a small avalanche of small rocks and dust tumbled downward. For such a scene to occur within a world at the pinnacle of the seventh dimension, it could only be said that this person was not only furious, but they also wielded power beyond the imagination of most. The location wasn't as one might expect and was rather within a governmental body of the Void Palace, a step below the Elder Legion that sent Cornelius on his mission to monitor Lionel. The structure of the Void Palace was impossibly complex, filled with numerous factions, each with their own grudges and histories that could stretch back hundreds to even thousands of years. It could even be said that the Void Palace itself was like its own separate ecosystem and world, diverging from reality. The Void Legion Elders could be considered to be the pinnacle of the powers of the Void Palace. They were the backbone, and their moniker was a reminder that their duty wasn't just to oversee, but was also to act as the strongest line of defense. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Beneath the Void Legion Elders there was the Void Council. This was the current location and was located on the second tallest peak of the Void Palace. The Void Council, also called the Senate, was made up of Void Senators from across disciplines and factions. The major decisions and rules that all those who came here abided by were drafted and put into law by the Void Council and their Void Senators. Unsurprisingly, with this sort of setup, the details of the true selection were also drafted up by the Void Council, or so it should have been. But it was either this infuriated Void Senator was ignorant to a decision made without him, or one of the factions had gone rogue. The one who had spoken was a middle-aged man with strength already into the 7th dimension. Without at least such level of strength, he would have never been capable of causing such a commotion. But it was also this strength that made it so impressive that the Senate managed to keep its structural integrity, only swaying side to side slightly. This man was Uramus and was the current party leader of the stalwart Polearm Party. He was a well-respected man, as he had to be to earn such a position. And right this moment he was absolutely furious. What was shocking though was that other than his party members, there didn't seem to be anyone else as infuriated as he was. Seeing such a scene, Uramus' chest heaved, his almost crimson gaze sweeping through the enormous Senate hall as though searching for his prey. He tried to meet the gazes of several other party leaders, but all he received in return was a shift of gaze and a glimpse into a guilty conscience. At that moment, a chuckle echoed through the Void Council, a man a head taller and a large measure skinnier than Uramus walking in as though he was gliding on clouds. "Rosen, this was your doing?" Uramus' voice boomed. Despite the seemingly embarrassing situation he had been in just moments before, he didn't seem to notice in the slightest. The veins across his forehead threatened to pop. Rosen was yet another party leader, however. His was known as the Unfettered Blade Party. It could be said that of all the parties here, the history between these two was not only the deepest, it also held some of the deepest grudges. "You shouldn't be frowning all the time like this, Uramus. It's not good for your skin. You already look much older than you should. Don't tell me you want to look even worse?" This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. I'm not here for your petty games, Rosen. Who decided to send a batch of fresh meat to the Void battlefield? Are you insane? They've barely adapted to the lowest level anarchic force of the mountain base, now you want them to adjust to an environment that's tenfold worse? This isn't training, it's sending them to their deaths. If I didn't know better, I would think that you had long since left the side of the human domain. This is our most promising generation in countless selections, yet you want to ruin them like this. Rosen's eyes narrowed, his playful demeanor becoming dark and as sharp as a blade. I would advise you choose your words more carefully, Uramus. There are certain things you can't get away with saying even if you are a brute. Bite me, you piece of shit. If it wasn't for the rules restricting me within the Senate, I would have already blasted your head into chunks of watermelon. Why don't you step outside and see how I'll deal with you? Ah. Rosen chuckled coldly. It seems that you're only so brazen because you haven't realized your predicament just yet. An air-headed fool like you really would take too long to notice the crux of the issue here. Under your shared majority, you've led the Senate into the trash heap, and it's about time that stop. Uramus' expression changed, suddenly realizing something. You dare? Rosen sneered. You've been voted out. Pack your things and scram. The stalwart Polearm Party has been demoted back to a faction. Take those trash you call subordinates with you. Uramus froze, feeling as though he had been struck by lightning. What the hell was going on? Announcement below. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1331. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:44 and 6 seconds p.m. Chapter 1331. Zavnik, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1331. Zavnik Uramus stood outside the tall bronze doors of the Senate in a daze, not quite knowing what had just happened. He didn't even know how to wrap his mind around this. The stalwart Polearm Party had been a party for over 800 years. They had been a majority or shared majority within the Senate for over 300, and yet they had been demoted back down to a faction. Just like that? Uranus suddenly couldn't feel rage anymore. What he felt wasn't helplessness either. Rather, he felt guilty that a legacy that had lasted so long actually suffered such humiliation at his hands. It had to be understood that factions were a very important part of the Void Palace. The Void Palace wasn't just for training youths, it was forging the future leaders of the human domain. As such, factions here represented something very different than it otherwise would. There were several levels to factions. Rookie factions, bronze factions, silver factions, gold factions, legacy factions, and finally, parties. From rookie to gold was fairly straightforward. They separated power based on the strength of their leadership, their accomplishments, their number of members, their average strength, so on and so forth. A legacy faction was a bit different. It wouldn't necessarily be stronger than a gold faction, however, it had been passed on and survived more than a single generation. This would happen when the leader of a faction promoted to greater ranks, left to enter a party, or was granted a title by a party. This wouldn't be considered a betrayal. In fact, a legacy faction would gain great prestige if their leader was recruited by a party. There were only 999 Senate seats and a limited number of parties could claim them depending on their feats of strength. A faction promoting to a party was extraordinarily rare, so rare in fact, that it might only occur once every few hundred years. As such, the most talented of faction leaders would choose to take this route. This chapter upload first at novel.bin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novel.next.com to experience faster update speed. Finally, there was the level of parties. Parties were those who held the truest power within the Void Palace to the point where they could assert control over the rules that governed everyone. Parties were split into minority parties, majority parties, and shared majority parties. There were also special ranks among these parties, for example, the party whip who was tasked with maintaining order, organizing votes, and other things of the like. Minority parties were unironically the majority of parties. They could control anywhere from one seat to a few. Majority parties were parties that controlled at least 500 seats, giving them de facto majority on all decisions regardless of how everyone else voted. Shared majorities were a bit trickier. They could refer to a single party which controlled less than 500 seats and as such might be overruled by the combined effort of all other parties. Or, in this case, it could refer to two or more clashing behemoths. The Unfettered Blade Party and Stalwart Polearm Party both controlled over 500 seats between them. As such, if the two parties agreed on anything, there was nothing the other parties could do. But that was exactly the reason for the latter's downfall. There were too many parties looking for a method to finally breathe and break through. The fall of a giant would result in an uprise in competition. They had been stifled for too long. Even now, Uranus had no idea how such a thing had happened. The rulebook of Void Senators was far too long and he couldn't be bothered to read all of it. He had thought that because they controlled 244 seats, no one could even dream of ousting them all at once like this. And yet, how could he not feel incompetent? His number one enemy had demoted them all the way from a shared majority party down to a legacy faction and he didn't even know how they had done it. Uranus listlessly stared up into the sky. This chapter upload first at novel.bin.net. Hours later, Rosen sat in his office. The Void Council Hall wasn't just made up of its gathering location, but also doubled as the main base of most parties. As the current sole shared majority leader, he was feeling very content. However, his expression was quite calm. And then the door opened. Rosen's gaze narrowed but didn't rise, nor did he seem too surprised. The young man that walked in did so leisurely, his expression not wavering in the face of Rosen's aura in the slightest despite clearly being several levels weaker. The young man was handsome, his overly chiseled jaw being a hallmark of his looks. His skin was bronzed as was his hair, a pair of hazel eyes acting as the centerpiece of it all. He was tall, standing at least 7 feet and his back was as straight as a javelin. Every one of his steps was measured and his every movement wasted not the slightest hint of energy. In one glance you might believe this young man to be a scholar, but in the next you might believe him to be a general. It was impossible to pinpoint accurately. It seems that you've taken my advice. Congratulations, shared majority leader Rosen. The young man smiled, taking a seat across from Rosen. Whether it was by his actions or by his words, even in the face of this lofty seventh-dimensional existence, he seemed to innately feel as though they were already equals. No, maybe that was just him giving Rosen some face. If the young man had his way, he might look down on the entire world. Despite only being within the 6th dimension, he had forced his seniors to dance on the palm of his hands. And even facing them now, he had no desire nor the need to be humble. Rosen stared at this young man deeply, not answering immediately. It was difficult to tell what it was he was thinking until he actually spoke. It seems the Morales family has an excellent pool of candidates this time around, isn't that right, young heir Zavnik? Chapter 1332. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:44 and 5 seconds p.m. Chapter 1332. More questions. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1332. More questions. Zavnik chuckled. Why do you make it sound like I'm the only one that benefits from this arrangement? It can't be you've already forgotten how much you've earned just from this alone? Rosen sat back in his chair, still staring as though he had already forgotten how to speak. He wasn't normally a man of such few words, but facing this boy, he seemed to have become a mute. Since things are like this, it might be best if we lay out all the cards. We've been speaking through coded phrases and tacit head nods for too long. Don't take this as my insulting your intelligence, I simply want the line to be drawn as cleanly as possible. You gained the right to change the rules of the true selection as you deem fit, the greatest control over the Senate's actions for at least the next few decades, and you've also given your rising star an advantage over the competition. When Zavnik said these last words, Rosen's pupils constricted. Though his heart remained steady and his expression remained indifferent, even for a person like him, there were certain ingrained reflexes that couldn't be easily circumvented. It seemed that he had still underestimated this brat a bit too much. He had thought that Zavnik would try to humor him a bit, but who would have thought that he had something like this up his sleeves? There's no need to be so surprised, Senior. It was a bit obvious, don't you think? Why would the mighty unfettered Blade Party risk falling from the good graces of the Void Elder Legion and offending so many powerful families and organizations just for the sake of sending a batch of youthful geniuses to their deaths? A lesser person might really believe that Senior was a traitor of the human race, wanting to cripple this generation. But you know something that most don't, right? Zavnik smiled. I was racking my brain trying to figure out what reason you could possibly have. I decided to think outside of the box. Rather than assuming the obvious and believing you to be a traitor, I made the assumption that this benefited you in ways that were rooted outside of just a weakening of the human race. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. At the same time, I realized that this might have been a death sentence for most other years, but considering the talent of this generation, it was more likely that such a challenge would result in casualties no greater than any other year, so it would balance itself out. And that was when I stumbled onto a clue. I heard your family has a young one that calls himself the Sword Deity? Zavnik smiled meaningfully, looking toward Rosen, who had already regained his composure. From the first sentence Zavnik had spoken, he had already expected much of the rest of this. It's quite interesting. Being a Void Palace disciple gives you access to a whole other world, but the restrictions are heavy. You can't even set foot onto a void battlefield until after having accumulated enough merits, and if you fail to gain access to one fast enough, you get punished with demotion nonetheless. It's an odd push and pull where on one hand, it looks like everyone is coddling you too much, and on the other, they want to thrust you off to your death. I've heard though that the situation of your Sword family is a bit precarious. The tribulation of Sword Domain is coming you very quickly, but the inheritor of this generation hasn't grown up yet. In a situation like yours, I would be stressed out as well. Unfortunately, your Sword Deity isn't much of one just yet. Unlucky if you ask me. But you're trying your best. The Void Battlefield is the most unique opportunity there is for your Sword Deity, as it represents more than just a death trap. However, you simultaneously also needed a reason to use the Void Palace's resources for your own personal gain without breaking any rules. We all know that the Void Battlefield is a land of death to some, but to a select few, it can be a land of opportunity. You know, as a Morales, I never really liked swordsmen, you're all quite annoying to me. However, for the sake of my goals, it seems I have no choice but to help out the enemy. The only unfortunate thing is that while I understand this much, I still don't know how much you could possibly gain from this. I wonder what target your Sword Deity has that's so important that he must risk his life in this way and can't wait just a few years to be led onto the battlefield naturally. Zavnik scanned Rosen's expression but could only sigh when he didn't receive the answer he was looking for at a glance. It seemed that his deductions would come to an end here, but he didn't seem to be too disappointed. In fact, his smiling expression was still very much there. Suddenly Rosen smiled. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. Do you believe that you're the only one with deductive abilities? I personally found it very interesting when I heard that there were only 2 amethyst tokens given out this year. That's quite a low number, don't you think? Zavnik chuckled. It is quite a low number. So, imagine how surprised I was when I found out my littlest cousin is among them. Rosen's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. Zavnik was too calm. If his goal was truly to kill Lionel, he should be sweating buckets. Such a large movement wouldn't fool that man. You thought I wanted to kill littlest Nova? What kind of big brother would I be if I planned all of this out to do that? My goals are much higher than that. I wasn't even aware that littlest Nova would be joining with this batch until just a few hours ago. By then, all of this had already been set into motion. Zavnik sighed. It can only be said that littlest Nova is unlucky. Or maybe he's quite lucky. I guess it would depend on the outcome, don't you think? Rosen's gaze narrowed firmer. Zavnik stood. Well, this is unfortunate. I wanted to have this meeting so that we could clear the air. But it seems that we'll be ending this meeting with more questions than answers. Zavnik smiled lightly and walked toward the door. Have a nice day, senior. With a light click, the door closed. What was the purpose of the sword deity on the void battlefield? What was so important that Rosen would risk public ire to allow him this chance? Zavnik had no idea. But, on the other hand, what was Zavnik's goal? Why would he, as a polearm wielder himself, cripple the strongest party capable of backing him? Rosen had no idea. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1333. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:44 and 4 seconds p.m. Chapter 1333. One rule: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1333. One rule: Zavnik walked out of the Senate with a light smile on his face, his expression carefree. He walked by the straggling members of the stalwart polearm party without a word, none of them being aware that the young man who had put them in such a state was right before them. He strolled down the pathways, his demeanor remaining the same. However, when he reached a patch of forest, his steps suddenly paused. It was you, wasn't it? The voice came from a shadow hidden behind a tree. Despite the fact Zavnik was at most a meter away, it was still difficult to see this person as though they had perfectly fused into the shadows. Still, Zavnik didn't seem to have a very hard time telling who it was. Smiling lightly, Zavnik shook his head. I'm not sure what you mean. The voice remained silent for a long while, but Zavnik didn't move either. It was as though the both of them had entered a state of tacit silence, each probing the other as though to check to see which of them was bluffing more than the other. I have to say it's quite an excellent move. First, Nova was just on the verge of becoming a core member of the stalwart polearm party, and now he's effectively wasted more than a decade of effort. Fourth, Nova also just managed to gain their favor and promote his faction to a legacy faction as well. If this was you, you've quite effectively crippled 2 of them. Zavnik chuckled. Even if it was me, your conclusion would be too exaggerated, don't you think? Crippling First Nova with just a single move? Is that even possible? Your attempts at probing me are just as terrible as they always are, Second Nova. We both know First Nova well enough to understand that this isn't a setback, it's an opportunity on a silver platter. So why would I ever do that? Indeed. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Despite not being able to see Second Nova's face, the narrowing of his gaze was practically palpable. The crippling of the stalwart polearm party might sound like a terrible plight for First Nova, but that was only if their eldest Nova was incompetent. The only one to truly suffer from this was Fourth Nova, but he was actually foolish enough to follow in the same path as First Nova as though there would be scraps to pick up and make use of. He had no one to blame but himself. With the regression of a party back to a legacy faction, especially a party with such deep roots and foundations, there would be a chance to capitalize. The heads of former management would likely roll, and that would allow new voices to bloom where they would otherwise not have a single chance. So, Zavnik was perfectly correct. First Nova would actually greatly benefit from this, and that was exactly why, though it seemed Second Nova was sure that Zavnik had acted, there was actually no way to tell, because the motive was simply too murky. Even he couldn't tell exactly what Zavnik's purpose would be if he had done this, and that made it all the more serious. The struggle between swordmen and spearmen was a tale as old as time itself. The push and pull of both factions had gone back and forth for too long. Even though most of the Morales brothers hadn't chosen to join the stalwart polearm party because First Nova had already staked his claim upon it, That didn't mean that they didn't benefit from the stalwart polearm party in other ways. Polearm wielders fell under the former party's umbrella of protection. With their fall, the changes would start subtly, but they could very well eventually snowball. It would start with less materials capable of manufacturing polearms being procured, then it would lead to less spears overall being forged, then it would lead to less investment in the discipline overall, less techniques created, less training rooms maintained, and eventually, you would look up one day and there would be less polearm geniuses overall. These would all be small, almost insignificant changes in the short term, but in the long term and on a large scale, it would soon become an avalanche. This would just be the tip of the iceberg. Second Nova wouldn't be surprised to see more sword fanatics in positions of power very soon, making life a living hell for those at the very bottom. This was the second reason why Second Nova just couldn't reconcile this matter. The grudge between the Morales family and the Swerd family, the Kings of the Spear and the Kings of the Sword, was just as deep as the grudge between the Morales family and the Forcecrafters Guild. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net there were no small number of Morales family members who were active members of the stalwart polearm party, and it was likewise for the Swerd family and the unfettered Blade party. Crippling the former would be like Zavnik shooting himself in the foot. None of it made sense. It's been a nice talk, Orin. Zavnik smiled lightly. You should really get rid of that habit of sneaking up on people. I'm used to it already, but what will littlest Nova think? Orin fell into silence for a moment before he responded. You weren't targeting our littlest brother, were you? His voice seemed to carry a hint of cold to it that hadn't been there before. Though Seventh Nova was the least threatening of them all due to his late start, he was also the greatest variable purely due to who his father was. With a wild card in play, maybe someone smart would prefer to take him out before he could grow. Zavnik, though, let out an exasperated sigh. Why did everyone think he was a murderer? Actually, he was a murderer. Just not one that would target his own family, and definitely not one that would target someone who was effectively his baby brother. You think my information network is better than yours? You tell me when you found out he would be here and if you'd have enough time to plan this in that span. These words were simple and Zavnik had already begun to walk past the tree as he spoke them. But they also seemed to relax Orin a great deal. It seemed that Orin would allow Zavnik to simply disappear. But, in the end he still got in another word. Third Nova, you're walking a thin line here. There's only ever been one rule for the Air Wars. Don't choose power over family. Zavnik chuckled. They'll keep that in mind, Second Nova. Chapter 1334. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:44 and 2 seconds p.m. Chapter 1334. Fast if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1334 Fast bang. A violent mouthful of blood shot out from Lionel's lips, his eyeballs threatening to pop out of their sockets even as all the air that had once been in his lungs was forcefully ripped out as though by the hands of a menacing god. The impact he felt against the opposing wall was just as devastating. If it wasn't for the improvement to his metal body, he would have experienced what it felt like to have all the bones in his body crushed at once. Lionel. Ana's part enraged, part worried cry resonated through the cave walls, both her and Little Black Star leaping to action. Son of a bitch. Lionel coughed and wheezed, trying to quickly regain his bearings. The group of three had just began to run, realizing the kind of trouble they were in. If they allowed themselves to be pinned down by the Rapax, their deaths would be practically inevitable. Their goal, first and foremost, was definitely to get out of the range of the location they had teleported into as quickly as possible. That way, even if the Rapax knew there were invaders, they would have a harder time finding them. Who could have expected, though, for them to hardly have traveled 50 meters before running into their first altercation? If not for Lionel's sturdy body, he would have already ended up blasted into bits and pieces of flesh and blood. Lionel only had himself to blame. He took the lead and rushed forward, protecting Ana and Little Black Star to his back. But, so confident in his internal sight and sense of danger, he rounded a corner, only to find a vicious straight leg kick waiting for his sternum. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net if you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Lionel had obviously not accounted for the most pressing thing. Or rather, it was difficult to do so. Internal sight was useless against Rapax. Because his sense of hearing had been impaired by the previous screech and because of the all-encompassing grotesque scent that filled the hive nest, Lionel had no way of hearing it coming nor smelling the distinct scent of the Rapax, landing him in such a situation. He could feel his ribcage bow and flex, almost snapping at its hinges entirely. He had never been more happy that his metal body had undergone such drastic improvements until now. The instant Lionel crashed against an opposing wall, he activated his bronze runes in full force, dispersing the strength of the impact across his entire body before he fell to the ground, his head spinning. I have to adjust. Locking onto Rapax is impossible, at least not until I can figure out a way to circumvent their natural protections. However, it's impossible that Rapax wouldn't affect their environment. Start dream simulation. Lionel's mind began to work at top speeds. Although he no longer had access to Tier 4 abilities, dream simulation didn't have such high requirements. The fact that it was one of the first abilities Lionel had created for himself spoke for itself. Quickly, Lionel went through his memory bank of battles with Rapax. He organized their movement patterns, their gait, their general impact on the environment around them. In the blink of an eye, he had finished and created a new pseudo-dream counter ability. He couldn't use the real dream counter as it was a Tier 4 ability he had created capable of triggering a reaction in his body without his explicit input. But he could use the principle of assigning a mind to a task just the same now. It was just that he would have to constantly divert overt attention to it. Lionel adjusted the way he used internal psi from a general sweep of the surroundings to a focused and dialed-in intention toward certain parameters. His thought process was simple. The Rapax could hide themselves from internal sight, but they couldn't hide themselves from the environment. If this was a grassy land, the process would be simple. Just look for imprints in the grass. Unfortunately, there was nothing but dry stone everywhere. However, this wouldn't impede Lionel in the slightest. Their tails swish at a certain cadence. Look for regular patterns in the wind. Wind is too unpredictable to have such measurable and constant repetition. Their bodies are heavy, though slight, and almost impossible to detect as they move, so will the ground tremor. It's difficult to detect their distinct smell in such an environment, but it's still possible to if I'm looking for distinct signatures with my internal sight. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net Lionel went out to list at least 100 other parameters, tweaking them to the point they fit in perfectly with the environment they were in, and all completed before he fell to a knee sinking down from the wall he had been smashed against. They'll call you Dream Detect. Lionel's head snapped upward, his gaze having regained its sharpness. He completed all of his calculations in a near instant, in time to see that there was just a single Rapax before them. This Rapax, though, was of Tier 9 of the 5th dimension, and its kick was no joke at all. Kill it before it can call for reinforcements, Lionel said quickly. Aina didn't say a word herself. She spun on her heels, her axe glowing with lethality. The Rapax, whose leg had just descended from its assault on Lionel, reacted quickly. Closing in the distance, it rose a knee to the skies, aiming to deflect and quickly counter. It was a combination that Lionel had seen many times. The Rapax loved to use their knees for defense as it could be retracted much faster than a kick. However, it was then that Lionel, who the Rapax likely thought would be out for a moment, sprung to action. His speed blazing as a trail of star force followed his path. The Rapax reacted almost instantly. Canceling its thoughts at countering, it fell back. Unfortunately, it hadn't seen that there was a third member of their party until it was far too late. Little Black Star appeared to the Rapax's back, his little claws glowing with a dangerous light. With striking precision, Lionel's punch and Black Star's claw landed at the same time, forcing the Rapax to take the full brunt of both. Little Black Star's claw ripped right through tender flesh, severing the Rapax's head from its body. I don't think this was a coincidence. Lionel spoke before the corpse even fell. We need to move fast, or else we'll be surrounded. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1335. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:44 p.m. Chapter 1335. Fertilizer. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1335. Fertilizer. With a thought, Lionel sent the Rapax corpse into the segmented cube. The one advantage they would have in all of this would be the size of their spatial treasures. The space Lionel had access to was practically unlimited. Like this, they would leave the least amount of traces behind that could be used to quickly find them, and this would also help Lionel bolster the resources he could use with the tentacle womb. However, none of this was the reason Lionel's brows were so furrowed. I have a feeling that the reason they separated us during the teleportation was less about the Void Palace being sadistic and more about them giving us a lifeline. When Aina heard this, she too frowned. She didn't need Lionel to explain anything else. They had been found far too quickly. Lionel had learned to minimize his mistakes in battle to a great degree as he gained more experience. Something like being caught off guard like that was rare for him at this stage. And yet, it had happened, all because Lionel had missed this very key detail. If Lionel was correct, teleporting them all individually kept the fluctuations to an absolute minimum. This way, the likelihood they would be spotted and found would be drastically lessened. Ironically, if separation had been part of the test itself, the Void Palace would have probably put more effort into making sure Lionel couldn't ignore the rules. But because it was only for safety measures, ignoring it hadn't been nearly as difficult. After reaching this point in his thought process, Lionel really had no idea whether he should be cursing himself or the Void Palace. In fact, why not do both? He had really stepped in shit this time. Still, regardless of how dangerous this is, there's still a chance to benefit. If this is a nest, then that means that there's probably a spot here where a ton of high-level Raypax are born. It would probably be a death sentence to fight a fully matured high-class Raypax, or rather a ruined Raypax like Y-Star Order calls them. But what about a baby that hadn't quite been born yet? The DNA is the same. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Lionel slotted this thought into the back of his mind. His first intention had to be to escape this place or to find a viable exit. This could only take second place. The nest regions would definitely be the most highly guarded. Trying to steal something from there, especially one of their more talented seedlings, would be like throwing himself into a pit of fire. Survival came first and foremost, benefits came as a very far-off secondary option. As they ran, Lionel's gaze flickered, taking in everything. He memorized the routes they were taking, but he was also paying close attention to the enormous holes above their head. Every so often, they would run beneath a large opening to the outside world reaching at least 300 meters above their heads. Jumping that distance was out of the question. However, it might still be possible for Lionel to use his wings to fly that distance. The trouble was that Lionel didn't believe doing such a thing would be smart. From Lionel and Aina's perspective, these holes represented an opportunity to escape. But, if you look at it from the perspective of a Raypax, each one of these holes was a security concern. And, with such a security concern, there would obviously be guardians overseeing it. Simply put, it was definitely more dangerous on the surface than it was within the nest. If they wanted to make use of these holes to escape, they had to find a point near the edge, furthest from the store of what Lionel assumed must be eggs. Only in that way would he be able to take such a risk. In that case, even if there were guards above, there would be fewer than one might expect nearer the center of the territory. Aina seemed to understand this as well and didn't question Lionel's choice. Instead, they all followed the wind, moving with it toward a hopeful exit. The flow of the wind seemed to be ventilating this smell. This should be why the flow is greatest beneath the holes. If we follow the wind until it weakens considerably, we should then be nearer the outskirts of the hive and be in a safer position to move up to the surface. Lionel felt that his deduction was correct, but he still reached out to Y-Star Order. In the end, the old man confirmed his thoughts. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. The smell isn't from what you think it's from. The Raypax had a very different culture from humans and don't like wastage. After a warrior dies, rather than being buried, they become fertilizer for the next generation. The more talented the lineage of the batch, the stronger dead warriors become the fertilizer for their growth. In their incubation stage, the eggs absorb nutrients from this fertilizer. Unfortunately, what's left behind after the eggs are done is highly toxic. I don't need to tell you that corpses are hotbeds for illness and disease. So, nests of Raypax have to be very well ventilated. Lionel frowned. That's true even for higher dimensional corpses as well? Of course. Don't you still need to sleep, shit and shower? Do you think that stops? At best, you'll just need to do less of it. You don't transcend mortality, that's fantasy nonsense. Seventh dimensional corpses just take a bit longer to rot. And, with the methods of the Raypax, they can speed up the process to help their young along. If anything, the toxins and diseases that can latch onto higher dimensional corpses are even worse. I would be very careful of corpse poison if I were you. I know a fool like you probably wants to go and take advantage of this situation, but not to mention the fact those guarding the main lineage nests are far stronger than you can imagine. It even requires their level of strength to stand in those areas without dying to a single whiff of the air. Lionel's blood ran cold when he heard this. The trio rounded yet another corner, heading further and further toward their destination. However, Lionel felt like his hair was still standing on end. That original screech that sent them running still replayed in his mind. It had most definitely not come from the Raypax they killed. Lionel came to a grinding halt, his gaze sharpening toward a particular region. At that moment, a familiar little violet puppy quivered. Chapter 1336. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 59 seconds p.m. Chapter 1336. This way if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1336. This way Lionel's expression flickered. He recognized the little puppy almost instantly. It was the very same little beast that had been following behind Simona. Clearly the little one had gotten separated from its owner during the forced teleportation. Why is it quivering though? A beast that could follow her around shouldn't be so cowardly. Lionel frowned, making the decision to turn away. Even if this beast was cowardly, there was no way that it was weak. And, at this level, beasts should definitely have intelligence no weaker than an average human, some even surpassing this level. He couldn't just randomly pick up a puppy for no reason. Shockingly, though, Lionel didn't get a chance to walk away before Aina appeared before the little one, bending over to pick it up. The little puppy dodged backward, its speed confirming Lionel's thoughts. Just the fact this little beast could survive so well within this thick anarchic force spoke for itself. There was no way that it was weak. Don't tell me that. Lionel felt a headache coming along. His father often said things about women that would end up with him sleeping on the couch if his mother was around. Among those things was his disdain with their fascination with cute things. Now that Lionel thought about it, everything his dad said about female nature was probably another trick he used to lure another into his bed. Lionel usually rolled his eyes when his dad said such things. But, if Aina was really doing this for the sake of cuteness, it seemed he would have to give his old man a point in his favor. This definitely wasn't the time to be soft-hearted. Lionel still remembered that the first time he met Little Blackstar he tried to kill him. Luckily the little one was practically invulnerable to attack. Though Lionel recalled feeling exasperated at the time. Now this situation felt eerily similar. It's okay little guy. Just come with me. Aina smiled a beautiful smile, her golden irises twinkling. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net if you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed the little purple puppy hesitated. But, under Aina's coaxing and likely a bit of her mental coercion, the little one was forced into her arms. Lionel's internal sight continuously swept through the surroundings as far as it could go. His range was even less here than it was in the forest previously. If not for his breakthrough in the heavenly body realm, he might have trouble stretching it past just his skin. Aina rose from the ground with the puppy in her arms. Right then she suddenly tossed it through the air at Lionel. Put it in a snow globe. Though Lionel was caught off guard, his reaction speed was very fast. Before the little puppy could react, it was trapped in a frozen time loop, unable to do much of anything except enter a deep sleep. Lionel raised an eyebrow. What? Aina asked. Did you think I stopped because it was adorable? Would this show you a favor? Lionel speechlessly watched as Aina turned and broke out into a sprint once again. As he followed, he couldn't help but wonder if he was having a bad influence on her, or if she was always this savage. Something was telling him that it was the latter. A third-party observer would definitely look at Lionel like he was an idiot. It wasn't the countless people she had decapitated with her axe that made her savage, but rather tricking a puppy into a benign cage that was. It was either he was blind or a love-struck fool. Lionel's lip couldn't help but curl upward. It was hard to tell if he even realized it was happening. Right then the pair came to a grinding halt. A fork lay ahead, making it difficult to tell which direction to go. It wasn't the first time they had come across a fork. However, before, the direction of the wind had made it easy to decide which way to go. This time though, both paths seemed identical wind-wise and they didn't have enough information about where they were in the hive to make a decision based on the direction either. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net Lionel stopped by Aina's side, his brow furrowed. He took deep, steady breaths, ignoring the foul smell in the air. Is it possible based on smell? Lionel asked. Aina had said that she was very sensitive to these things, so maybe she had a general idea of where the nutritious nutrients she had sent before were. Even if it wouldn't be a 100% guarantee, they would just have to pick the direction opposite of it and hope that the pathway didn't curl or turn oddly. Unfortunately, Aina shook her head. The strong winds override the natural movement of the scent a lot. There's no difference between following the wind and following the smell. Lionel nodded. He had expected as much. So, it was a 50-50 chance, huh? Lionel very much doubted that both paths would lead to an exit. Or even if they did both do so, he was certain that one would be safer than the other. Let's do it based on this then. These nests probably need a large supply of water. Since we're guessing anyway, let's do it based on which direction has the weakest water force concentration. Aina's brows suddenly shot up. That's not a bad idea. But instead of doing it with water force, let me do it with life force. Lionel nodded. This was indeed the better idea. He had almost forgotten that one of Aina's main affinities was life force. It was already high before she removed her curse. He could only imagine what level it had risen to now. This way. Lionel didn't refute Aina. Logically, the location with the highest life force would be the direction of the core of the nest. Not only would it have the strongest warriors guarding it, but it would also have the Rapak's eggs. Every time the pair came across a fork, they would take the same approach. However, the uneasiness in Lionel's heart grew every time they did. Their frequency only seemed to increase. Chapter 1337. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 58 seconds p.m. Chapter 1337. This king if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1337. This king, what's going on here, old man? I've never been stupid enough to enter a Rapak's nest, how the hell would I know? Lionel's heart felt uneasy. It was like his heartbeat had gone hollow, ringing in his ears and sending an odd wave of something slightly less than pain through his chest. It wasn't quite piercing enough to harm him, but it was too great to ignore at the same time. The more uneasy Lionel became, the colder his gaze got. Eventually, they began to flicker with a smoldering flame, the temperature around him even rising for a moment. Aina shifted her eyes from the path ahead to land on Lionel's side profile. But not long after she did so, she found herself looking into his eyes. If it comes down to it and I try to bring you into the segmented cube, don't resist. Lionel spoke, his voice tinged with a hint of cold. Aina stared at Lionel deeply for a long while. It didn't seem like she would respond at all after a while. But when she finally did, her choice of words were like a baffling sledgehammer to Lionel's chest. I am stronger than you. Lionel, who hadn't looked away from Aina, continued to do so. Despite the fact the words should have been shocking, he didn't seem to react like it was at all. His pace didn't falter, his expression didn't change, and his heart seemed to have regained its calm bearing. Don't think that I'm just saying that to say that. Aina continued. I'm not making it up, nor am I only stronger than you by a small measure. Aina didn't need to make it up. When her and Lionel's internal sights fused, she realized that her ability could be extended to others through this incredibly intimate action. Though not as detailed as when she used it on only herself, she could tell Lionel's deficiencies and had a vague idea of the path he could take to improve himself as well. Of course, she would never give this information to Lionel because of how vague it was. It could very well be skewed. But it was still enough for her to tell the gap between them. Lionel hadn't been joking when he said that Aina would be a greater challenge for him than Miguel would be. In fact, Lionel hadn't yet caught up to where Miguel would be at 100% since he had yet to catch up to Aina. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. I already know this. Lionel responded, his voice not wavering. Aina's brows furrowed. However, if I fought 10 people just as strong as you, I would still win 10 out of 10 times. Lionel's violet hair danced in the wind, a stronger tinge of purple suddenly suffusing within them. At that moment, Aina's furrowed brows slowly relaxed, her limbs becoming looser and her stride becoming wider. Her hair fluttered as well, a deep coercion reflecting all impurities from her body. Lionel looked ahead as well, exhaling a heated breath, his body seeming to glow. I really hate you, Aina suddenly said. Then why do you follow me? Lionel asked without missing a beat. Because I also love you. Aina replied, her tone even. A silence fell between the two. The sounds of their steps were so light that nothing of their passage was left behind. As for little Blackstar, he was even less of a problem, gliding through the air as though it was solid ground and vanishing into the void without the slightest issue like a fish on water. I love you too. Aina's eyes widened, her head suddenly snapping in Lionel's direction. But before she could react, she found a hand having appeared on her shoulder. Leon. Aina vanished into the segmented cube just as Lionel rounded a final corner. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. Aina stood in a daze within the expanse of the segmented cube for just a moment before her fury bubbled over. A violet rouge fog erupted around her, her hair grew to the length of a river and her gaze became like a piercing dragon's. She roared, her rage so palpable that the garden around her was vanquished into an ashy pit under nothing other than the oppression and density of her force alone. The worst part about it all was that she couldn't tell whether she was more enraged by the fact Lionel had done this to her again, or if it was because she had no idea whether Lionel had meant those words he had just said or had just used them as a method to distract her into not resisting. Anna's head rose into the skies, roaring at what felt like nothing. She broke through another tear, entering Tier 6, and yet she didn't seem to notice in the slightest. Lionel stood on the other side of the corner, his breathing steady and his gaze cold. What he saw across from him, though, was enough to make almost anyone else's heart freeze over. The ruined Raypax stood as though it had been waiting all along. Though its demeanor was different from a human's, Lionel could still feel the air of nonchalance around it. Even after noticing Lionel, it hardly reacted. It stood in place, its body as unwavering as a mountain. Its body was an entire meter taller than the Raypax Lionel was used to, standing at 4 meters even with its overly slouched back. The very same silver plates danced across its body. However, there was a very distinct difference here. All across its plated armor, dense, swirling tattoos of black could be found, giving it both a profound air of majesty and a secondary air of oppression and warlike violence. Lionel's veins pumped with a reddish gold, his skin beginning to glow as bronze runes awakened all across his body. With every exhale, another heated fog would manifest until his body was coated from head to toe in a gorgeous silver and sky blue armor. Lionel could very clearly see the spurs that had begun to grow on its pill-shaped head. They were subtle and not too large, but they were enough to tell Lionel what he needed to know. Spurs on the tail denoted the 5th dimension. Spurs on the head, though, denoted the 6th. Lionel's force erupted. Come on, you alien piece of shit. This king has a beauty to protect. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1338. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 56 seconds p.m. Chapter 1338. Blind spot. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1338. Blind spot. Lionel's body erupted with a swirl of fog. A dense blackness, an oppressive violet and a deep crimson. Without the slightest hesitation he activated. Bang. The air around Lionel exploded, the oxygen around his feet releasing crackling booms of violent chain reactions as the flames within him ignited. It filled Lionel's body up to the brim with vital force, accelerating his healing factor and pushing his body to the brink, pushed him past those limits. From the very beginning, combustion was meant to take advantage of Lionel's nodal pathway, igniting his blood and surrounding his heart in a wreath of flames. In this state, his body was at its very strongest. Give me everything you have. 2 orbs of crimson hovered in place of Lionel's eyes, the viciousness of his demeanor finally making the ruined Raypax somewhat more alert. Yip. Little Blackstar body seemed to double in size, his fur standing on end and his long whiskers jetting outward like finely pointed needles. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. However, under Lionel's orders, Little Blackstar didn't move at all. Hovering in the air, a strong surge of might came out from the little guy, suddenly causing the force in the surroundings to begin to increase in density and the anarchic force to concentrate. Lionel had only given Blackstar a single command: make them choke on anarchic force. Bang. Lionel sent out 4 punches in quick succession, his forward momentum and the twist of his hips fusing as one to bear down upon the ruined Raypax. For this creature, who was very much used to its overbearing pressure severely weakening opponents it felt was far weaker than itself, this was something completely unexpected, resulting in Lionel's fists actually landing. The harsh sounds of metal banging against metal resonated through the air, ripples of concentrated wind and sparks of volatile flames flying off in every which direction. The ruined Raypax found itself sliding back against the stone ground, its large curled claws scraping against the ground and leaving behind shallow imprints. A short silence followed. The ruined Raypax's head seemed to tilt downward, its gaze, or what Lionel thought was its gaze, looking down at the region where the latter's fists had landed. It seemed surprised that such an ant would actually dare to attack it. Or maybe it was surprised that it had actually been pushed back. The ruined Raypax looked back up. The silver shell that covered its head didn't seem to have any slits for eyes, making it difficult to tell if it was really looking at all. But the feeling, at least to Lionel, felt the exact same. Bang. Maybe the ruined Rapax had thought its nonchalant reaction would affect Lionel, or maybe it thought that the intimidation of its growing and more serious aura would at least cause him to pause. Whatever the reason, the ruined Rapax stood unmoving as Lionel launched yet another series of attacks, seemingly just as baffled as the first time. Lionel didn't even seem to register the failure of his first volley of attacks. In fact, he only grew more furious, the relentless pursuit of a stronger and stronger attack barreling down upon the ruined Rapax. This chapter upload first at novel.bin.net, /. The movement of the ruined Rapax was so sudden and fast that Lionel only had the time to cross his arms above his head. Even replaying his perfect memory, Lionel couldn't find the image of the Rapax having raised its leg, and yet by the time he registered it, a vicious axe kick had nearly crumbled him to his knees from above. In inaction, the ruined Rapax had been as steady as a mountain. However, the moment it moved, it was like a relentless, explosive avalanche, the monstrosity of its attack power feeling like enormous implosions going off within Lionel's body. Even with his bronze runes fully activated, just this one attack alone made Lionel feel as though his body was collapsing. Still, even in such a situation, the fierce glow in Lionel's gaze didn't falter. In fact, despite their crimson hue, they seemed decidedly cold. Thoughts of everything else vanished, his entire mind focusing on the creature before him. Even without the ability to lock onto it with his internal sight, Lionel dissected everything he could, an eerie calm cooling his head. Blind spot. That was Lionel's ultimate conclusion. This Rapax was using a special style that took advantage of its innate ability to avoid detection of internal sight. Like this, it was able to levy attacks using speed and timing to make it seem as though it had practically teleported into place. This was exactly why, despite standing right before it, Lionel had somehow missed a leg raising into the air. It took Lionel just a single exchange to comprehend this, and he adjusted accordingly. Bang! Under the relentless pressure, Lionel's knees crashed in the ground, his forearms threatening to shatter entirely. However, almost the instant the ruined Rapax rose its leg, so too did Lionel rebound from the ground. It looked as though he had used the hard stone as a trampoline, fighting back against the strike of the ruined Rapax just enough to have such an effect. The ruined Rapax had already prepared a second attack, but Lionel leapt over it, his knees tucking and his arms spreading out as though to balance himself in the air. If the ruined Rapax could display human emotions, its eyes would have most definitely widened even as its brows shot up. It had executed its technique perfectly. How had this human, clearly in such a bad situation, dodged? Lionel landed on the ground as light as a feather, his body exploding forth as he landed a vicious kick on the side of the ruined Rapax knee joint. He drilled everything he had into it, his vital force, destruction capabilities and universal force all coming together to form a torrent of wind that even manifested from the other side of the ruined Rapax's tough shell as well. Chapter 1339. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 55 seconds p.m. Chapter 1339, Vessel. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1339 Vessel. Lionel didn't wait for the result of his attack. He instantly erupted with the full force of the heavenly body realm, rotating to the back of the ruined Rapax in one fluid motion. As expected, Lionel's attack wasn't nearly strong enough to snap the ruined Rapax's knee. But it was just enough for it to lose its balance while it had a leg in the air. And just as predicted, its tail quickly flickered, stabbing into the ground with a dull thump to keep it upright. Even for a sixth-dimensional ruined Rapax, stabbing through a ground of a seventh-dimensional world like this, especially one continuous tempered by the erosion of anarchic force, was a difficult task. The result, what its scorpion-like tail catching a small bit of earth before slipping, only to quickly stab down again to achieve true balance. But by the time it had done this, Lionel was already to its back, his fists glowing like two radiant suns as a moon and planet appeared to his back. The moment they did, Lionel's dark ice domain erupted, making the ruined Rapax feel as though its body was stuck in limbo. Lionel's gaze flashed, his mind entirely focused on the tender flesh of the ruined Rapax. His star constructs shrunk down violently beneath his command, their strength concentrating into fine points as level 2 golden spear force manifest under Lionel's will. Bang! Bang! Scree-cree. Lionel drew blood. The spurt of bluish liquid reflecting in his irises as two holes appeared on either side of the ruined Rapax's spine. However, despite the minor victory, Lionel's expression didn't shift even the slightest bit. With smooth steps he glided backward, dodging the whipping tail of the ruined Rapax. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed with a thought, Lionel's meteor construct manifested. Following the momentum of the furiously whipping tail, the beam of metallic gold enveloped the scorpion-like spikes and increased its weight several-fold, causing the ruined Rapax to misjudge and overcorrect, veering its tail off course and out of its control for a few precious fragments of a second. Lionel's moon construct flashed, the ruined Rapax conceptualization of time dilating. In those moments, the ruined Rapax felt as though it had suddenly entered a dream. No matter how fast it ran, it wasn't fast enough. But, in this case, no matter how much strength it put into swinging its tail back after missing, it didn't seem like enough. The gorgeous white planet to Lionel's back layered this effect. While the moon attacked the ruined Rapax's mind, the planet construct attacked its physical body, fusing with the affecting of the meteor construct and pressing down with an oppressive gravity. The fluidity of Lionel's actions were seamless. One action rolled into the next, his mind working at warp speeds and his calculations becoming more and more precise with each passing second. The ruined Rapax found itself swinging from being off balance on one side to suddenly overcompensating and being caught completely off balance toward another. It was right then that Lionel's second prepared attack flourished. His spear domain crown glowed, shimmering with a blinding golden light that washed the dark tunnels in a kingly might. His vital force brought his body to the very brink, the flames surrounding his heart forcing it to heat up and pound relentlessly. And finally, his forces fused into one, piling on top of one another relentlessly. Lionel had learned a lot about his spear domain lineage factor after his recent breakthrough. While it seemed like the only change was that his spear force had gone from a more normal and bland white color to a piercing gold, this was far from the case. Lionel had come to understand that while his spear force could be powerful on its own, it could also act as a vessel and conduit for his other strengths. Why was it that every spear domain spear felt so unique? Each had its own unique element or ability to it. Such a thing felt odd. Should they be more focused on the purity of the spear itself as a weapon? Why was it that some focused on water, others on fire, yet others on lightning or light? The answer to that was simple. From the very beginning, the spear domain lineage factor was capable of absorbing all things, becoming the foundation of a warrior's style no matter what kind of ability or other affinities they might have. So, when Lionel fused his light elemental, fire elemental and star elemental forces into his spear force, it was as though a dry land had suddenly been blessed with a flood of water. It greedily swallowed it all, its insatiable greed fueling its rise in power. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. That's it. A crack suddenly resonated in Lionel's mind, his irises flickering to life as a red-gold rune formed within their midst. As though being infused with a raging new power, Lionel's spear force gained a tinge of crimson, forming into a drill under the strength of his star constructs and aiming for the back of the ruined Rapax once again. Bang! The result was far outside of expectations. Lionel found himself being slapped flying, his ribs breaking in several places and a projectile of blood leaving his lips and marring the inside of his helmet. Lionel could only use the tendrils of darkness from his beast armor to break his impact against the wall, but even that hardly made it better. With a grunt, Lionel slid down an opposing wall, the menacing roar of a ruined Rapax bearing down on him. The ruined Rapax's mouth had split over, revealing a long row of sharp, saliva-dripping teeth and a tongue longer and more rugged than any Lionel had ever seen before. In the blink of an eye, it had already appeared above Lionel, its menacing mouth dripping. Lionel coughed again, his gaze looking up as he slumped to the ground. It seemed that in the end he wasn't able to predict the next attack like he had the first. Lionel had maximized his chances by minimizing the amount of times the ruined Rapax could attack, but he couldn't seal the deal. However, even now Lionel's gaze was unmoved. "Haven't noticed something wrong with your body yet?" Lionel asked coldly. The ruined Rapax froze. Fallen Apostle ebook should be live in 4-ish hours, I think, or whenever the 24th is for you. If not, it will be sometime tomorrow. Big thanks to you guys for always supporting me. Linkter. E/Ospec, October 23, 22. Chapter 1340? Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 53 seconds p.m. Chapter 1340. No use if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1340. No use. The concentration of anarchic force in the region had reached a point the ruined Rapax had never experienced before. In its rage, and also thanks to Lionel's moon construct dilating its senses, it hadn't noticed until it was far too late. And, to make matters worse, albeit just the small wounds, the open gashes on its back seemed to become a prime spot for the most vicious force in the universe to assault. Lionel had thought a lot about the Raypax in recent days. Among what fascinated him the most, aside from their ability to escape detection of internal sight, was their odd use of force. This race of being didn't use force like humans did. Or rather, they might have only done so in part. They didn't pull on atmospheric force and seemed to rely entirely on what their bodies could produce. It could be said that they were completely antithetical to much of the battle style Lionel had forged in recent years. Because of his apprehension toward his Scarlet Star Force innate node, Lionel rarely if ever used his internal force, relying entirely on outside measures. However, what was truly interesting was that after beginning to use his nodal pathways and force nodes as he should, Lionel was still very much certain that his efforts were different from the Raypax. It was something deeper than just using internal force, something more profound. Even when Lionel used his internal force, it didn't seem as fused and one with him as what the Raypax could accomplish. It was clear that the Raypax were fusing with their force on a much deeper level, a level Lionel couldn't fathom. And that was when it clicked. How was it that Lionel's metal synergy lineage factor worked? Well, his bronze runes became the conduit by which he could absorb the essence of ores and foundationally change his body. It etched onto his bones, his inner organs, and even his blood vessels. When thinking to this point, was it truly a coincidence that the most powerful of the Raypax were known as Runed Raypax? This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. The mechanism was likely not the same, obviously. But Lionel felt that it was highly likely to be similar. And just like Lionel had runes within his body that others could see with the naked eye, so too would the Raypax. With that thought in mind, Lionel realized that this should have been the source of the Raypax strength. They absorbed force during their practice and infused it into the runes. Upon doing so, they could assimilate with this force, fuse with it, and make it their own, thereby strengthening their bodies manifold over. So, why was this so important now? It was because all the precious source of force that the Runed Raypax pulled upon was within its body, and it was precisely these sort of dense regions of force that anarchic force liked to latch onto and swallow the most. Lionel believed that if he could just make the Raypax suffer a wound, a deep enough gash that its blood flowed and the anarchic force could get a taste of, the creature would suddenly find itself in a predicament that it would be hard-pressed to crawl out of. Scree! Lionel slowly stood from the ground, a hand across his chest and ribs as the Raypax struggled and screeched. The size difference between the two was enormous and the strength gap was even more exaggerated. And yet, it was Lionel who stood, a cold expression on his face and his aura bearing down as though this was just the obvious outcome. "There's no use in screaming," Lionel said lightly. "I've learned in recent times that the higher up in dimensions you go, the more reliant you are on the push and pull forces of force itself. It's quite fascinating, really. Even a shout won't travel as far in a higher dimensional world as it would in a lower one, let alone when the anarchic force is so great. Why do you think I dared to battle you instead of just running?" Lionel had no idea if the Runed Raypax could understand him, but he didn't seem to care, his cold eyes calculating everything as the Raypax soon found it difficult to even stand. The anarchic force concentration had been multiplied to the point there was practically no other force to pull upon in this region. Maybe the only two existences that could survive beneath such a concentration was a little beast with void beast blood and a man who had spent the last several months torturing himself on an even greater quantity. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. When Lionel seemed to have seen all he needed to see, he turned his head toward Little Blackstar. "Yip." The little mink dove down. Unable to even resist at this point, the Runed Raypax could only put up a futile attempt at resistance before Blackstar exited out the back of its skull, having entered through its mouth. Before the Runed Raypax could die, though, Lionel sent it into a snow globe. He had no way of knowing if the Raypax sent out signals after their death or if there was a method of keeping track of them. Though he was quite confident in the concentration of anarchic force stopping pretty much everything, given the fact the Raypax had become used to this environment over such a long period of time, there was no way of telling whether they had more sophisticated methods of dealing with this, and Lionel didn't feel like finding out. Coughing heavily, Lionel looked down at his chest. That one kick had almost broken all of his ribs. In fact, he was lucky that each had only broken in one spot. If not for his sturdy body, the result would have likely been countless little shards of bones piercing through his lungs and heart. "My healing factor is so slow in this world," Lionel debated whether or not he should use his. But after a moment he decided against it. He could still hang on. Picking a direction, he sprinted out of the dense concentration of anarchic force. Then, taking a deep breath and bracing for the worst, he brought Aina out once again. Bang. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1341. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 51 seconds p.m. Chapter 1341. Bang. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1341. Bang. Lionel coughed up another large mouthful of blood. Son of a bitch, he had gotten far too used to seeing this ceiling today. But he hadn't expected to see it after saving a beauty. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. Who wrote this bullshit? Unfortunately, it wasn't over. Lionel had hoped that a single strike would be enough to vent her rage, but he had hardly rebounded off of an opposing wall when he found another fist nearing his face. Lionel reacted as quickly as he could, crossing his arms over his head. But, to his astonishment, it had been nothing more than a feint. What looked like a dainty hand, completely dwarfed by the size of Lionel's own, smashed a fist into his chest, sending Lionel into the wall again. The pain wrecked Lionel's body, his partially healed ribs cracking cleanly once again with an audible snap. With how powerful Lionel's body was, every injury he suffered was like metal being snapped in two. Even his muscles themselves were like intertwining steel cords, layered atop of one another with a strength that spoke for itself. The second wave of pain seemed to snap Lionel awake, the helplessness in his gaze vanishing and leaving behind a hidden sharpness. Lionel immediately entered a defensive position, tucking his elbows to the side of his body and raising his fists to opposing sides of his face. Like this, he could finally see the rampaging Aina before him. If it wasn't for the ridiculous situation he was in, he might have spared a thought for how much of a war goddess she seemed to be right this moment. This chapter upload first at novelbin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Her tight beast skin clothing clung to her curves, her muscles pulsing with a vibrant power. She released a barrage of kicks and fists, entering a furious berserk state as though she wanted nothing more than to see Lionel beaten into minced meat. Lionel couldn't seem to find a gap to counterattack. Aina's assault was seamless, and even though she rarely used her fists and legs like this, her battle sense didn't seem to take even the slightest hint. In fact, after just a handful of exchange, a glow took hold of Aina's body and Lionel's brow furrowed. Fist force. Suddenly, Aina's attacks became sharper. Lionel realized he couldn't stay on his back foot like this, or else all he would be was a glorified punching bag. Even his metallic body was starting to feel as though it was being kneaded into a soft dough beneath this woman's relentless barrage. He took a strong step forward, taking advantage of his powerful defenses and swinging a punch out that ignored everything. He just needed to break Aina's rhythm just enough that he could find a chance to counter. However, he had only just opened up his defenses when Aina's figure seemed to flicker, her fist connecting with his chin as though there was a magnet connecting the two. Lionel felt his head spin, his hook losing momentum. Without dream sense, he couldn't shake his mind awake fast enough, and he quickly suffered a shin to his hip mere instants later. Damn it. Aina's violent barrage seemed to leave craters in Lionel's body. He bounced around like a pinball. Every time it seemed like he would escape, he'd find another fist or foot in his path, throwing him back from whence he came. That's enough. This chapter upload first at novelbin.net. Lionel's roar was like a clap of thunder, however it didn't waver Aina's assault in the slightest. It rolled off her shoulders as though it was never there, but by then, Lionel's gaze had already become a frightening cold. The Aina reflected in his gaze became nothing more than a slab of meat, a simulation hovering within his dream world. Going from the difficulty in calculating a Rapak's next move to the ease of calculating a human seemed to fuel Lionel with a sharper mind. It was like he had just spent years in a low-oxygen environment, only to suddenly have all the air he could breathe at once. His body thrummed like it had been hit with a spike of dopamine, his movements suddenly becoming so sharp and calculated that Aina was forced to take her first step backward. Fists and knees clashed as though cinder blocks. It didn't sound like the resonating echoes of flesh and bone. Rather, the two were like machines of war, commanding their mechs to leave devastation in their wakes. What Lionel lacked in battle prowess, his mind made up for in spades. What Aina lacked in calculative ability, her innate senses and reflexes covered for several times over. The two were like a whirlwind, twin cyclones rampaging about and only seeming to grow more and more violent with each passing moment. Their eyes locked across the short distance that separated them, their irises flickering with an undisguised coldness. Bang, bang, bang. Elbows, knees, feet, even a headbutt or two when they seemed to have completely run out of methods to attack. They were absolutely relentless, seemingly holding nothing back. Little Blackstar hopped in the air from side to side, completely agitated. It was like the poor little guy was watching his parents fight and didn't even know how to go about stopping it. The little mink could only let out exasperated yips from time to time, making it seem like he was trying to get to them to stop but to no avail at all. It was as though the two had completely forgotten that they were in enemy territory. In fact, with the way things looked now, maybe it was lucky the Rapax didn't come across them in such a state, or else the first to be ripped apart would definitely be them. Bang. Their fists collided through the air, both being forced to skid back. Their arms hung in the air, their eyes still glaring at one another. Hot air billowed out of both of their mouths, their lungs and limbs screaming. However, they didn't speak a single word. Chapter 1342. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:43 and 49 seconds p.m. Chapter 1342. Familiar words. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1342. Familiar words. Little Blackstar was caught between relief and panic. Even though the constant barrage had finally come to a stop, the little guy was emotionally intelligent enough to know that things wouldn't just end with that. Maybe the two had only stopped at this point because past this was most definitely a state of no return. Their stamina already seemed to have taken a large hit. If they went any further, they really wouldn't be able to deal with any danger that came. I should have done this years ago. Aina spoke coldly. You must think I'm really afraid of you. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, and clearly it's because I've been too easy on you. Lionel's lip twitched. This woman seemed to have entered a demonic mode. I promise you this. Every time you do this to me, I will beat you until you're completely unrecognizable. Last time I just ran away and apparently that made you think me to be soft. It won't happen again. Lionel suddenly got the impulse to touch his face, only to realize that his raised arm looked as though he had stuffed several balloons beneath his skin. His expression flickered, and by the time he actually touched his face, he realized that it was completely swollen as well. It was then that Aina's words about beating him until he was unrecognizable seemed to ring in his ears again. She wasn't just saying that, she had been serious. Her control of her strength was so great that her every punch, kick, knee and elbow managed to generate the greatest damage to his flesh, resulting in these exaggerated bruises all across his body. Lionel had been so certain that his aches and pains were from his battle with the ruined Rapax that he didn't even notice that he was being turned into a charity case. Lionel was speechless. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Every time you do this to me, I will beat you until you're completely unrecognizable. He could see by the fire lit in her eyes that she really meant it. It didn't matter if they were in the middle of a Rapax nest, if they were deep within enemy territory, maybe even if they were in the middle of fighting a war, she would truly drop everything to beat him up. What kind of nonsense was this? The worst part was that even though it felt like a joke, Lionel could feel how livid Aina was. The fact she had only gone so far was actually an outward showing of restraint for her. If she really unleashed everything, it wouldn't be her fists cutting into his body, but rather a bloody axe. Aina was right. Last time he did this to her, she had just left everything and disappeared. This time, however, it seemed she had taken a different approach. But this sort of approach wasn't something that Lionel cared for at all, especially not when he had just cracked his ribcage open to ensure they could both get to safety. Rather than being thankful for that or showing any appreciation, he was actually greeted with more pain. Fine. He had already been prepared for the backlash his actions would come with. But wasn't this too far? If she wasn't, Lionel's brow furrowed when his thoughts reached this point. He never usually cared if an enemy was female or not. Had anyone else done this to him, he would have definitely did far more in revenge. He didn't like this weight hanging around his every action when it came to this woman. It was like he couldn't be his true self. Lionel lowered his fist, his expression only becoming colder. And yet, Aina stood right across from him, her expression not softening in the slightest at all. Her demeanor seemed to scream that no matter what Lionel said, she would meet him from lower ground, even if that lower ground required a fist. If you can't understand why I do things the way I do, what's the point? My mom said something very important to me a few months ago. When someone shows you who they are, believe them. Trying to change a person will never work. You're doing nothing but wasting your time. Every time this situation happens, I will take the same course of action. No amount of tantrums you throw will change that. And, if there ever comes a day where this tantrum of yours really compromises our ability to survive, while you've made a promise yourself, I can promise that in such a situation, you'll disregard any mental blocks I have toward harming you entirely. Trust me. If there's one thing I'm good at, it's getting rid of mental blocks. I hope you'll show some propriety and not allow things to get that far. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Aina stared at Lionel deeply, her own oppressive aura still rising. Even the earth seemed to rumble beneath her. I can promise you if that day really does come, I won't hold back either. If you think you're the only one holding back, you have another thing coming. My axe won't show mercy. Lionel's brows furrowed, his frown deepening. After a moment, though, his expression completely relaxed, a detached sort of appearance being all that was left. If that's how things are, then it's better for us to go our separate ways. I can't have a liability who can't understand how I see things by my side. You'll be nothing more than a ticking time bomb. Aina sneered. Understand how you view things? What about how I view things? The only thing that matters is my final decision. If you can't trust me to make it, then you might as well go call someone else king. Lionel's voice boomed, a wild violet aura raging around him. The oppression of his mind's coercion seemed to stream forward like a raging tide, a tsunami that only seemed to grow taller with every passing moment. However, Aina's rage somehow still seemed more palpable. Her hair fluttered wildly, her canines seeming to grow a measure as her irises sparkled like drops of ambrosia. A king also knows when to listen. You keep talking about trust this and trust that, but all you really want are blind followers that will both do everything you ask them to do on a whim, and yet also allow you to take control of everything at the same time. You keep asking me to have trust in you, but where's your trust in me? What's the point of building a kingdom if all you want to do is fight on your own? Do I look like a fragile flower to you? You're a hypocrite. A fucking sociopathic hypocrite. Lionel froze. Chapter 1343, published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 48 seconds p.m. Chapter 1343, Northern Magnet. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1343, Northern Magnet. A hollow sound rang in Lionel's ears, almost as though an enormous explosion had gone off in his surroundings and now only an eerie sharpness of what remained of his hearing was left. Even with all the sensory perception and infallible memory in the world, in just those few seconds, it was as though his mind was blank. He couldn't see or hear anything, nor could he remember what kind of thoughts he was having. Lionel never hid anything from Aina. There were secrets he probably should have kept from everyone around him that would have probably made it easier to protect their safety that he had still chosen to tell to her. And there were secrets that weren't so important, but were far more personal, that he had still decided to tell her as well. But there were two things Lionel had never told Aina. Whether consciously or subconsciously, he never even began to express them. It was hard to tell if he had done it on purpose or if it was a sheer coincidence that he never got around to doing so. But one was hard-pressed to believe that two such important things just happened to be matters that Lionel didn't get around to telling someone he usually told everything about. The first was Lionel's true status as a dark prisoner. He never explained anything about his evaluation as a child, how this had estranged him from the Fox family when he might otherwise have grown up with a fine relationship with the royal family, or how Lionel had taken his place. The second, though, was related to the specifics of that night after Aina was forcefully teleported to Terrain. And how that night. The words Aina had just spoken were the exact words James had said to him that day. These were two memories that Lionel had long since buried deep within him, and with his control over his mind, he never thought about them. Unlike a normal individual who might stumble onto such thoughts from time to time and suddenly find themselves flashing back to that day, Lionel was completely different. Could be said that since those events happened, this was maybe only the first or second time he had thought of them. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed in that moment, he couldn't seem to escape it. Without access to Tier 4 of his ability index, he couldn't control the facets and knobs of his mind as easily as he could before, resulting in a relentless flood that bombarded his thoughts and threatened to turn his brain to mush. He could suddenly remember everything about that day. The devastation of the artillery shells that had fallen around them, the screams of women and children who were caught in the crossfire, and even the light reflected in James' eyes when he said those words, his father's gun still held to his temple. Are you sure that you want me to kill him? Lionel could remember looking deeply at James, still very much wanting his deductions to be wrong. Maybe it was a coincidence that the man holding a gun to James' head was so tall. Maybe the resemblance they shared was overblown by him. Maybe he had overestimated the strength of James' great energy shield ability and underestimated the power of a bullet. Maybe, just maybe, his best friend of over a decade wasn't trying to drag him toward his death. Just maybe he was wrong for once. However, his mind was too sharp. He could see that change in James' expression immediately. He could feel his best friend's heart skip a beat even under the influence of all the noise. At that moment he knew. He knew that the friend he had come to know was gone. I'm disappointed. I really took you as my closest friend. Lionel had meant those words more than anything. James was his closest friend, his best friend, his brother. Their personalities were hardly anything alike, but they were inseparable. It was the kind of relationship that Lionel couldn't explain even if he tried. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If he was honest with himself, maybe James had just as much to do with his moral code than any of his father's teachings had. Being drilled again with the importance of respect and persistence was nice, but there were so many ways to interpret those two words. Who deserved respect? What kind of goals were worth being persistent in the face of? The answers to these questions was probably more important than the mantra themselves. If Lionel's father had been his compass, James had been the magnetic pole that wrenched him northward. This wasn't because James was so morally superior. In fact, James was an asshole, not much unlike how Lionel's father had been in his youth. He used women like rags, he didn't care enough to pay much attention in school, he put no effort into anything because his family was rich and famous, and he hadn't hesitated to attempt to betray the hopes of dreams of a team filled with his brothers for his own selfish goals. There was nothing about James that screamed moral direction. But that was ironically the very reason why he was so profoundly important to Lionel. Despite his flaws, despite how seemingly worthless he was, despite how by every observable metric that decided human value according to society labeling him a net negative, Lionel had always loved him. James had always been his brother. The first person he told about Aina, the only person who knew how much he hated playing quarterback, the only person who knew what was hidden behind his perpetual charismatic smile. To most others, James was worthless scum. And yet to Lionel, he was invaluable in a way that was just impossible to explain. And if even someone like James could hold such supreme value to him, then who was he to cast judgment upon the worth of anyone else? But, bullshit. James suddenly roared. You pretend to care about so many things, you pretend to be kind-hearted, but all you really care about are things ending up exactly like you want them. You don't like killing only because you don't want to deal with the guilt. You don't like playing football only because you didn't get to choose it. You only want to do things your way and nothing else matters. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1344. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 46 seconds p.m. Chapter 1344. A betrayal long ago. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1344. A betrayal long ago. Remembering back now, Lionel could understand why James had reacted that way. When he spoke his truth, saying that James was his closest friend, remembering the details of how it had happened now hit him like a ton of bricks. His voice had been so cold, so detached, so emotionless. It was as though he had said it all perfunctorily, as though he was shaking his head toward a child that had disappointed him rather than been heartbroken at the betrayal of a friend. By that point he had already disassociated, ripping that part of himself out and ignoring it like he always had. Even when he knew that James had betrayed them during the biggest game of the year, Lionel hadn't said a word, just silently finding a method to win anyway. Just like he always did. He didn't approach James, he didn't ask him what was wrong, he just did things as he pleased, finding a solution that could please everyone. James got to appease whoever had commanded him to lose by making it obvious he had done his best, and Lionel got what he wanted, another victory. When the two met in the locker room, Lionel could remember how livid James had been. You knew you'd get the unnecessary roughness call, right? I know you too well. You don't like to lose, but you're too soft-hearted to call me out on my bullshit too. So you'd find a way to protect our friendship and ignore it all while winning the big game anyway. Am I right? This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. If you knew I needed your help, why couldn't you lose this one time? This is just a game, isn't it? You've already won it 3 times, did you really need to win a 4th? You don't even want to be a quarterback. The words still rung in Lionel's head, even down to James eventually apologizing. At least then Lionel had still been able to lace his words with some sort of emotion, some sort of understanding and sympathy. But afterward he seemed to have completely lost that ability. While he stood there months later, Aina gone from his side, his body beaten and tired, an entire fortress of enemies eagerly waiting to take his head, Lionel hadn't truly felt the weight of the events. He had been confused by James' words. He even remembered thinking them to be a jumbled mess of nonsense. He had even somewhat arrogantly thought that this was just another case of James not being quite eloquent enough to say what he needed to say, another example of his imperfect best friend displaying his lack of value to the world. But could Lionel still love him now? Even after such a betrayal? Was that even possible? You're a fucking sociopathic hypocrite. The world seemed to go white for Lionel. Lionel remembered that he said many more words after that, words that had even left James as white as a sheet and as silent as a mouse. But in his ears now those words seemed to ring hollow. Leaving James speechless wasn't a feat. Hadn't he arrogantly proclaimed that his so-called best friend wasn't very good with words to begin with? It was ironic. He loved James like a brother, and James could be said to be the very reason he didn't become the sort of person who could treat human lives like weeds. And yet, in order to come to that conclusion to begin with, hadn't he needed to assign some value to James? Didn't he need to mark him down as someone worthy or unworthy? Make a list of his deficiencies before deciding whether or not he was still worth loving or not? Whether he was still worthy of being his friend? This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. When you thought about what that truly meant, it was sick. As though Lionel thought of James like a little pet project of his, a poor little boy who no one else wanted, but that was okay because Lionel would take him under his wings anyway. Maybe James, in all his simplicity, could actually feel Lionel's true intent. While everyone else only saw Lionel for what he showed to the world, James saw Lionel for what he was. In all his flaws, some far more tragic than others. It couldn't be said that James was a good person. It was the direct opposite, in fact. He had put his own selfish desires above even the safety of Lionel's life. Maybe he had told himself that he would be able to use his influence over his father to ensure that Lionel would live even after being caught. But that would have been nothing more than a coping mechanism for his own cowardice in being unable to stand up to his own father. However, this had only made it easier for Lionel to ignore his own flaws. James was the only person who knew him so intimately, the only person who understood how his brain worked and how he saw the world. Even if James couldn't put it into words, how would he have felt knowing that he was just another calculation to Lionel? An odd quirk in an otherwise logical world that Lionel was so fascinated by that he just had to keep him by his side? Maybe James wouldn't have been able to express exactly that in words, but he would have felt it. That sort of lingering inferiority. The kind that cast the mind into a perpetual, endless darkness. The very same kind of darkness he couldn't escape from in his own family and father. It probably would have felt to James that the friend he thought would always have his back had betrayed him long ago. That what they had built their friendship upon was nothing but a bed of lies that Lionel had concocted. Everything seemed to hit Lionel all at once. Like a rushing tsunami, it crashed into him, burying him deep. He suddenly found that he couldn't breathe, his face turning blue and his body suddenly not functioning properly anymore. Everything wanted to shut down around him. Chapter 1345. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 45 seconds p.m. Chapter 1345. Semantics. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1345. Semantics. How long had it been since he had access to Tier 4 of his ability index? Lionel only had a very vague understanding of abilities when he began his journey. However, by the time he had been able to comprehend, he had already entered Tier 4. It could be said that from the very beginning, he had always been in such a state. What did that mean? It meant that since the very moment Lionel had awakened his ability, he had gained with it a perfect sort of control over his body that extended to his mind. This sounded like a great thing, but when he was completely ignorant to what he was doing, he was essentially digging himself into a larger and larger hole every time. Whenever Lionel believed that he was able to easily cut off his emotions because that was just the kind of person he was, naively believing that this would have no impact on him since he could so naturally do it, The reality of it all was that this was just an example of his ability at work. It had to be understood that Lionel wasn't like the people of Earth. He had been born with his ability index and he didn't have to wait for the metamorphosis. The only reason it didn't manifest in full force until after the metamorphosis was because of actions his father had taken. Now, however, Lionel's ability index had suddenly been suppressed back down to Tier 3 for the first time and Lionel had no method of dealing with it. Aina, though, had no idea what she had just triggered within Lionel. Though it felt like a long time and that going through such a long list of memories had taken forever, the reality was that even after dropping down to Tier 3, his thinking speed was well beyond the imagination of most. It was to the point where Aina was still in the middle of speaking even after his body seemed to have hit a wall. I don't know why it's so difficult for you to understand. I know I was wrong in the past to make you want to stay away from danger, but can't we at least compromise? Is it so impossible to meet in the middle for you? Why can't we just fight together? That's not even the point. I wouldn't even mind if you had a plan that I couldn't be a part of, a plan that you know I'd be detrimental to. But would it be impossible for you to communicate that? Why are you so stubborn? Do you really see everything you go off and do on your own as heroic and protective? I don't see it that way at all. It's demeaning. It's like you can't be bothered to trust no one other than yourself because no one could possibly touch your lofty existence. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Aina's chest heaved, her gaze a furious shade of gold. But it was right then that Lionel's figure stumbled, his hand involuntarily reaching for his chest and his face becoming a ghastly shade of blue. In order to maximize his efficiency, after learning the full extent of what being in Tier 4 meant, Lionel began to push himself past normal limits. Normally, even something most allowed their bodies to regulate like the cadence of their heart or the flow of their digestion was entirely controlled by Lionel. This allowed him to put his energy toward the best things imaginable. After his ability index fell down to Tier 3, these functions obviously shut off and were handed back to Lionel's body to regulate. The change was seamless as everyone's body was designed to handle this matter regardless. However, Aina's words seemed to have shocked Lionel and his mind was now in a state of fighting against itself. He wanted to wrest the control he had lost back to make these feelings go away, but the trouble was that he was no longer in Tier 4. If a normal person wanted to accomplish the impossible, they would just be finished. They would try to tap into abilities they didn't have and they would fail. End of story. But the trouble was that Lionel had a lineage factor that quite literally gave his will strength. King's might. Now, Lionel's mind was in a furious state, wanting his ability to evolve and transcend its limits, but the anarchic force in the surroundings was simply too potent to allow such a thing. This sort of tug-of-war caused Lionel's body to completely shut down. His blood stopped flowing, his heart stopped beating, even his brain itself seemed to want to close up shop. Lionel? Lionel. Aina's expression warped wildly as she dove forward, catching Lionel's head just before it smashed against an opposing stone wall. But she was immediately shaken when she felt just how cold his skin was. If there was one thing that Lionel was perpetually, it was hot. His fire affinity was so high that this was undeniably the case, there was simply no escaping it. Lionel's body went rigid before everything suddenly loosened. His skin and face went completely blue, his lips following soon even as the whites of his eyes bulged with red blood vessels behind their lids. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. Lionel. To Aina's horror, Lionel's heart actually wasn't beating at all. She immediately used everything she had learned as a 5-star medical professional of Earth, laying him down and beginning CPR, but it felt that no matter what she did, it wouldn't matter. Aina's face was filled with panic. She could have never drawn the conclusion that her words had caused this, so she immediately thought that it was because she had fought Lionel. The ruined Rapax must have left behind more severe wounds than she thought and her subsequent fight with Lionel must have triggered them. The guilt was enough to overshadow her world entirely, tears beginning to stream down her face completely outside of her control. Yep. An anxious little black star dove down from the air, pulling at Lionel's hair in hopes of waking him up before furiously licking at his cheek. Right then, something within Lionel snapped, his body convulsing. Lionel's eyes suddenly shot open, a blinding light beaming out from them as a force art more complex than words could describe began to revolve within them. In an unknown corner of the dimensional verse, a handsome middle-aged man yawned, shifting his glasses upward as he scratched his ass. At that moment, he looked upward, his mouth still open in mid-yawn form before he shook his head. Aya, that brat of mine is always ruining my plans. What is that, twice now? Why can't you just follow the normal schedule I so painstakingly drew out? You're going to make this old man seem incompetent. Whatever. I have an excuse to see my beautiful wife again so soon. Hopefully she doesn't make a fuss about it being an avatar again. I'm trying to save the world here. It can't be that such small semantics is going to make a hero like me go without sex, right? Velasco tossed an odd ball of force casually, and yet it shot off into the distance, disappearing over the horizon near instantly. Chapter 1346. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 44 seconds p.m. Chapter 1346. Worse than changing diapers if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1346. Worse than changing diapers. Lionel. Aina had done everything she could, even pressing down so forcefully that the ribs Lionel hadn't broken yet snapped cleanly. But she was well aware that when a medical professional had to choose between a few broken ribs and restarting a heart, there was almost no decision to be made. Bones could heal, but a dead heart would never come back. The sudden flash of Lionel's eyes gave Aina hope, but the sudden and dense cloud of auspicious air that began to grow in the surroundings almost made her suffocate. This was the first time she was experiencing auspicious air personally, but she somewhat knew what it was. The trouble was that she didn't understand why it was suddenly coming out of Lionel's body in droves like this. At that moment, a certain beam of light ripped through the cosmos, appearing on the outskirts of the void battlefield and diving through its barriers. In a blink, it had appeared above a familiar hive, and in another, it had already flashed into the segmented cube without even Aina's knowledge. The ball of force appeared in Lionel's room, a region he had begun to use to keep things meticulously organized. It could be said that his room had become his functional spatial ring. As usual, it was spotless and clean, not that Lionel used it very often to begin with. Tucked into a corner, a familiar silver disc sat. Without much hesitation, the force buzzed and entered the dictionary, causing the mechanisms within to snap into a different configuration, its gears dancing and complex runes beginning to form along its surface. In the next moment, the disc began to hover, leaving the shelf, and was tucked upon as a looming shadow began to envelop it. In the blink of an eye, that shadow took form, becoming the outline and eventual real body of a man Lionel was all too familiar with. Velasco held the dictionary in his hands, flipping it in the air and letting it land onto his palms as he strolled out of the room. A Rapak's nest? It seems someone is getting greedy. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. The moment Val stepped outside of Lionel's room, he raised an eyebrow, looking off in a certain direction. But, in the end, he completely ignored it. With a step, he vanished, appearing in the dense black fog of anarchic force alongside Aina and his brat of a son. Truthfully, it almost instantly became an awkward situation for Val. Aina was a mess, her tears coming out in a torrent. She alternated between using what felt like almost way too much force compressing Lionel's chest and kissing him with her, well, very snotty face. Val couldn't help but feel like he had walked into a melodramatic scene. But when he looked at Aina again, he clicked his tongue. Not bad, at least this useless brat of mine gained at least a small bit of my skill. Despite the fact anarchic force was an excellent sound insulator, Val was simply too close, and his presence even as an avatar. Well, it could be said that he had certain piercing qualities that made this concentration of anarchic force not too big of a deal. Who? Aina spun around, her axe leading her turn. Despite the state she had been in, she hadn't forgotten the kind of dangerous region they were in. From the very beginning, her senses had been primed. Oh my, is this how you greet your in-laws? Well, I can't say you're very different from my wife. Val flicked a finger upward just before Aina's axe could bury itself into his shoulder. Ding. The axe arched through the air and over his head, swinging in a long semicircle before just barely gliding over Lionel's nose and crashing into the ground. Aina's face turned completely pale for two reasons. The first was because she had no method of fighting back at all. And the second was because she had almost taken Lionel's head off, just an extra centimeter downward, and he would have been left with only a part of his nose. The worst part was that after being placed on its trajectory, Aina seemed to have completely lost the ability to alter its path. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. She ended up spinning completely around, her axe just barely slicing into the ground enough to stop. But the issue was that she knew that she didn't have nearly enough strength to cut into this stone. The strength difference was so enormous that she couldn't even fathom it. Even with her ability, she couldn't begin to make a plan on how she would get so strong. The peak was simply too tall. Aina was so dazed and worried that she didn't even register the words Val had spoken until several moments later. By the time she had thought of all sorts of methods she could use to run away with Lionel. When it clicked though, she froze. What? Aina, whose hands had already found their grips latched onto Lionel's clothing, ready to leave her axe behind to rip him away, suddenly couldn't move. Val had already appeared on the other side of Lionel. He ignored Aina, shaking his head. Though he seemed unperturbed, this really was already the second time one of his plans didn't go as expected. Well, maybe it was to be expected considering what his actual goal was. Maybe even for him everything going too smoothly was too much to expect. Troublesome kid. This is worse than changing diapers. Val pressed a finger to Lionel's forehead. Almost the instant he did, half of the density of auspicious air vanished. Sealing it too much will probably have a contrary effect. I guess I should let it free itself a bit. The momentum of Val's press lessened somewhat, but the auspicious air continued to recede. It's not time yet, brat. Try to do things on a schedule for once. The complex force arts rotating within Lionel's eyes slowed, many portions of them vanishing until a far less complex force arc remained. However, even that eventually vanished, its presence remaining barely a lingering thought. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1347. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 43 seconds p.m. Chapter 1347. At best, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1347. At best, slowly, the odd aura around Lionel seemed to recede. Eventually, even the natural color of his skin returned. It was obvious at a glance that this wasn't because his issues had been resolved, but rather because, for some odd reason, his ability index had returned to Tier 4, allowing him control over his body again. Val stood up and stretched. With a flick of his finger, he sent the dictionary back into the segmented cube and yawned. Welp, I'm going to go and see my wife now. Bye. Val began to stroll away without a care in the world. But such casual actions left Aina baffled. That was it? He was just going to leave just like that? Wait. Jim? Val turned back, looking down curiously. Lionel. What's wrong with him? Val blinked, looking toward his son. His mind is imbalanced. It's not entirely his fault, it could be said to be mostly mine. But, due to certain reasons, things need to stay this way for now or else the consequences will be even worse. Aina's expression sank. Nothing's changed? From what Val said, it sounded like it was Aina's words and not her actions that had caused this. This didn't change the guilt she felt much at all. If it wasn't for Val's appearance, Lionel would have very likely died here, and she was having a hard time reconciling with that fact. But if nothing had changed and Lionel had only gone back to his baseline, that made things even worse. That meant that he had suffered like that for nothing. Even though Val's previous words seemed to imply that he would grow stronger, that wasn't something Aina cared about. She was more worried about Lionel's mind and his psyche from here on. What would she do? This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Val hummed. That would depend. Anyway, try not to die. Val tried to leave again, but he was once again stopped by words Aina spoke. Given his usual temperament, he would have likely dashed away and pretended not to hear anything. But, given Aina's unique status, he guessed that he should probably be a bit more patient. He had heard his son talk about this girl for years, and this was the first time he was meeting her. Why? Fear so powerful? Why put him through this? Val scratched his chin, pursing his lips a bit. Truthfully, he wasn't very much of a fan of explaining himself. He was usually right anyway. What was the point in getting the opinions of other people? Well, there was one woman who always forced him to explain himself anyway. Would he really get a daughter-in-law like that too? How much had he sinned in a previous life to deserve this? The world isn't as simple as you think it is, little girl. My real body isn't so free to do as it pleases. Though I wasted 17 years raising this brat who keeps giving me more trouble every other day, it seems. You know, that's not how the script is supposed to go. I was supposed to be the father that vanished after his birth, but a certain annoying family actually deemed to. Forget it, there's no point in talking about all this. All you need to know is that these matters aren't so simple, and if I don't do certain things, You two wouldn't get the chance to be two snotty-nosed brats making out in a rapak's nest. Aina's face turned a furious shade of red. Making out? She had been clearly performing CPR. How had it been twisted under the words of this man like this? Thinking back to all the things Lionel had told her about his father, Aina realized that he hadn't exaggerated at all. This man really didn't act his age, and apparently he also didn't act in line with the power he had. Still, seeing that he was being so vague and not answering much of anything, Aina also understood that there wasn't much of a point in pressing. Val had wanted to explain, he would have. Seeing Aina lower her head and fall into silence, Val sighed. He had grown soft, it seemed, feeling bad about such meaningless things. This was what happened when you had a wife and kids, your edge vanished. Eventually this would come back to bite him. All right. Val waved his hand and a strong suction force formed. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. The segmented cube, still in its finger wrap form, flew into his hands. I know you're awake, stop throwing a temper tantrum. Leave me alone. You son and father pair are just the same. Me? The same as this brat? Can't you see how much more handsome and suave I am? If he gained 10% of my skill it would be his blessing. Aina's lip twitched. Bah. Leave me alone. I need to rest. Yes. You can rest, just give me a rundown of what's been happening. Skip anything too unseemly. I don't want images of my son's poor performance in bed running through my mind. I have enough bullshit to deal with. Aina suddenly wanted to find a hole to bury herself in. Couldn't this man be more subtle? Where was the sense of propriety? Her face became like a shimmering lantern of red. She fixed her gaze to the floor, biting her lip. Val's gaze went blank for a moment as a subtle pulse of energy wafted out from the segmented cube. But just as quickly he snapped back to reality. I see. Alright, easy fix then. Anastasia, siphon away some of my strength. Make a barrier of about level 2 strength around lab 1. Fine. Val flicked a finger and the segmented cube zipped back onto Lionel's finger. Finally he looked at Aina. You want to fix him, right? Simple. When he wakes up, tell him that he can forget about his Little King role-playing game until he can break that barrier. Oh, and tell him that I have enough power in a single cell to shatter that barrier 10 times over. Val waved a hand and strode away, his laughter causing the rapak's nest to quake. A king? What a joke. Your old man's still alive. At best you can be a little prince. Chapter 1348. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 41 seconds p.m. Chapter 1348. Just like. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1348. Just like. Lionel shot up, his forehead almost banging against Aina's. But, in a final moment he managed to come to a grinding halt, suddenly finding that the control he had over his body had reached a truly exaggerated degree. For a moment, their noses were barely a millimeter apart, their gazes locking. Even with the terrible scent hanging in the air, Lionel almost became too keenly aware of Aina's own delicate fragrance by contrast. He had no idea how she managed to not latch onto the stink the rest of this place had, but maybe he should never challenge a woman's ability to remain clean. Lionel's expression flickered, his mind suddenly running through everything it had been through in just the last several minutes. His brows furrowed. He had more control over himself now, but he didn't quite know how he should be reacting. His instinct was just to shut it all down again. Seeing Lionel's expression growing colder, Aina suddenly spoke. Your father said. Aina repeated everything Val had said verbatim, not holding back. She thought about taking the edge off of the words, but in the end she decided against it. She thought that with the relationship Lionel had with his father, maybe the rawest form of what he had said was exactly what Lionel needed to hear. Lionel was astonished, not knowing what to say for a long time. My dad was here? Lionel blinked as Aina nodded. He sent his mind into the segmented cube and he did indeed find that Lab 1 was surrounded from all sides by a barrier. Even without trying, he knew that he didn't have a single chance at even cracking it, a calculation that he was surprised his mind could even accomplish, let alone complete so quickly. Lionel seemed to get the message loud and clear. This was how large the gap between him and the peak of the dimensional verse was. No, this couldn't even be considered the peak of the verse at all. At best, it could be considered the pinnacle of the middle tiers. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. In truth, Lionel didn't need to hear this at all. Just the information that his dad had been here was enough to paint the picture. To be able to so casually enter a Raypack's nest then leave as he pleased without a word. Well, it all spoke for itself. Lionel suddenly smiled, his gaze lighting up. Aina was completely caught off guard by this. She couldn't truly understand. The words Lionel's father had spoken might seem benign from a certain perspective, but from another, they were the kind of words Lionel would hate to hear the most. She had come to learn of what her mistakes were in the past. She didn't give Lionel the support he needed even though he had always been there for her. This was why she had resolved that no matter what happened between now and the future, she would always be here. Her fighting it out with Lionel didn't mean she had already given up on this. It was just her way of showing that she had no intention of giving up on him. Maybe it wasn't the perfect method, but they were ultimately still young and she had spent most of her life without a normal range of emotion. It had been the only way she could think of to force Lionel to see her perspective. Ironically, though, it had ended up being her words that triggered all of this, but that only made it all the more baffling. Everything about Val's words had been a culmination of everything Lionel hated. His father's words had doubted him, belittled him, and even put him in his place without care or reserve for his face. So, why was it that Lionel was grinning and laughing? Aina hadn't been nearly as harsh when she said similar things. She had only warned Lionel that the dimensional verse wasn't the kind of place that could be underestimated. She didn't want him to put his life on the line just for the sake of saving people he didn't even know. She wanted him to stay by her side, safe. It was then that it seemed to click for Aina. The love that Lionel had for his father made what he might feel for her feel small and meaningless. There was maybe no one in his life and Lionel respected and adored more than his father. She had thought that because of how Lionel had practically worshipped the ground she walked on, that she could speak more freely than 99% of people in his life while in his presence. In a certain respect she wasn't wrong. But it was always a matter of relativity. The things that Val could say to Lionel weren't the sort of things that she could get away with saying. At that moment, Aina came to understand. Lionel had put a lot of effort into winning her heart, years even. By this point she would be lying if she said that she cared for anyone more than she cared for him. In fact, Lionel and her father held equal weight in her heart. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. Maybe that was because her relationship with her father wasn't nearly as good as the one Lionel shared with his own, but there was a certain level of love that blood ties could form that other forms of love otherwise couldn't. And yet, Lionel had managed to reach that level for her while she had yet to reach that level for him. The truth was very simple. Despite his smile and charisma, Lionel was arrogant to his very bones. He had a relentless drive to win, he felt his opinion was more likely than not the right way to go, and he felt that questioning and doubting him were things most people simply didn't have the right to do. Even Aina herself. However, his father was very different. If there was one man that was his better, that had the right to question him, to doubt him, that might very well have an opinion that was superior to his own, it was Velasco Morales. A challenge from anyone else made Lionel turn his nose up. A challenge from his father, though, stoked the flames in his heart and made his gaze light up with ruthless ambition. Much like the day Lionel began to learn to craft, this time was not much different. Just a prince? Okay, for now I'll just be a prince until I can kick your ass, old man. Lionel's skin reddened, his veins pulsing with a dense reddish gold. A singular rune floated within each one of his irises, his blood rushing throughout his body. In that moment he became keenly aware of just how close Aina's nose was to his own. His fiery gaze met hers, his elevated heartbeat seeming to resonate between them. Aina's skin flushed red, looking away and pulling back slightly. Something about Lionel's eyes made her feel like a deer in headlights. But it was precisely because she did this that she didn't react in time to a pair of lips pressing onto her own. Somehow, it felt just like the first time. Chapter 1349. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 40 seconds p.m. Chapter 1349. Explain in words if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1349. Explain in words. An explosion went off in Aina's mind. Of all the things she thought would happen today, this was the very last. For a moment she couldn't sense anything else but the sensation on her lips. Her heart fluttered, her blood ran hot, and her lower belly pulsed with an odd feeling she would have trouble putting into words. Her weight subconsciously fell onto Lionel, her palm pressing to his chest and her lips weighing heavier on his as though to fuse with him. With how Lionel had sat up and how she kneeled on both legs, the shift in balance wasn't a lot, but it was usually more than enough to force someone else to waver. And yet, Lionel's body was like a sturdy wall, not shifting in the slightest even as Aina leaned into him. Little Blackstar, who had fallen into complete silence the moment Velasco had appeared, tilted his little head to the side. Even with all the emotional intelligence in the world, the little mink was ultimately still a child, and this situation was confusing nonetheless. They had gone from Lionel playing the part of valiant hero, to Aina unleashing a barrage of punches and kicks at his expense, to Lionel nearly dying, then to Aina meeting a man she was incredibly nervous around, then to Lionel being insulted maybe worse than he ever had in his entire life, all to end in kiss. When Aina's foggy mind cleared and the reality of it all snapped into place, she pulled back quickly, her palm leaving Lionel's chest and becoming a fist that pressed into her own. She breathed heavily and erratically, her mind all over the place and her body flushed red. Aina didn't seem to want to look Lionel in the eye. There was something about this that felt wrong. She was one part happy, another part apprehensive, and a large part confused about how she should be feeling. Felt good. Felt really good. Even if she had never experienced it with someone else, something in her intuition told her that Lionel was the only one who could possibly make her body feel like this with what amounted to a simple peck on the lip. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. He hadn't touched her body, he hadn't used his tongue, he hadn't even used any great pressure or coercion. In fact, it was she who had found herself leaning heavily into him as though wanting for more. And yet, she felt like she had flown to another world for a moment. Why did you do that? Aina asked softly. The happiness came too quickly. In one moment she was made keenly aware that she lacked true stature in Lionel's heart, and in the next, he was making her feel as though she was riding on a cloud. She felt that in one part she should be angry, and she even somewhat felt used, but she still couldn't bring herself to feel that way. Because I really wanted to. Lionel said as though it was just a matter of fact. And maybe it was to him, but that didn't answer any of Aina's question. That's not an answer. Isn't it? Lionel smiled. Aina's heart began to beat wildly again. Lionel's words were definitely not always like this. At the very least, he couldn't always make her hang on to his every word like this. The Lionel she remembered was charming, but he also had a streak of boyish innocence and naivete to him. This Lionel felt more forceful and determined. Was this the change brought about by his goal? If Aina was honest, she hadn't spent enough time with Lionel post his decision to pick up on this change. It might have also been because she had spent most of that time trying to get him to change his mind about said goal. However, there was no denying that this Lionel held an even more lethal attraction to her, one that was far more difficult to ignore. It awoke a bit of her masochistic tendencies, something the previous Lionel had entirely failed to pick up on, but this Lionel would likely be far more in tune to. Aina was both frightened and excited by this prospect. But after a moment she took a deep breath and calmed. After a second deep breath, she had returned to her baseline, her flushed skin receding and her gaze finally meeting Lionel's. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. Explain it to me in real words. Aina said gently. Lionel blinked and thought for a moment. You're a distraction. I can't focus on the task at hand or make harsh and necessary decisions when you're around. In the time we weren't together, my progress was far faster than anything I've ever experienced. However, it's become more difficult to ignore you than I thought. My mind ends up wasting its potential power output by diverting some of its attention to suppressing and locking away emotions I would otherwise feel. But I've gotten way too ahead of myself. My dad is right. If he's alive, at best I can be a prince. There are certain burdens I shouldn't be taking on right now, burdens that would ultimately have the opposing effect to what I want. Instead of helping me in the future, it will instead slow my progress now. Since that's the case, there are certain things that aren't worth it. Treating you like a subordinate instead of my queen, for example, is one. It's objectively a foolish waste of time that would, theoretically, help me to stay focused and keep an eye on the future. But, in the short term, it strains our relationship unnecessarily, while in the long term, no human has an infinite amount of patience. Even if you are determined to stay by my side now, it's impossible to tell if you'll still feel that way in 10 years or 20 years or more time than even that. And if I keep you by my side during all that time, while insisting to not cross certain barriers, it only makes the day you eventually snap and give up all the more devastating because you would have been such an important and ingrained foundational pillar of all I had built until that point. Given that, just shut up and kiss me again. Aina's lips stifled what would have been the rest of Lionel's explanation. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1350. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 38 seconds p.m. Chapter 1350. Weird Mind. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1350. Weird Mind. Ana had realized something very important. The weight of Velasco's words to Lionel weighed more than anything else. If Ana had known what Velasco had said to Lionel months ago, she would have realized even more so how true those words were. Listen kid, I always told you women were complicated. You spent 4 years chasing after that little girl, she probably thinks you'll always be there for her whenever it is she wants to come back. They were a sprawl of words randomly thrown into what was assuredly another prank, but Lionel seemed to have latched onto them. It made it far easier for him to draw a line in the sand and maybe was part of the reason he had been so callous to Ana's words that day. It could be said that if there was anything Ana was certain of now, it was that Lionel wouldn't always be waiting for her. He hadn't come to stop her wedding, he hadn't been the catalyst who saved her, he hadn't even checked up on her afterward, and it all culminated in maybe the greatest heartbreak she had ever experienced in her lifetime. However, Ana was very determined about one thing. She didn't know how long it would take, she didn't know what she would have to do, but she would definitely one day be able to say words to Lionel that weighed just as heavily as his father's did. To her, this wasn't a matter of competition, but rather a reminder that she still had efforts to be made. The reality was that she didn't like Lionel bluntly breaking down their relationship into gains and losses, benefits and pitfalls. She hated it so much that while Lionel had been following her request to explain it in clear words, she had to fight back the will to punch him in the face, again. This was the reason why she had stopped him despite him doing exactly what she had asked for. This chapter upload first at novel.bin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. However, she understood that this was truly how Lionel saw things even if she couldn't quite understand. Maybe his method of courting her in the past, his perpetual smile, his following her every step in action, had never really been him. That Lionel was always the version of himself he had thought she would want. It was the very same naive stage every young man went through, chasing after the woman of their dreams. They made the very false assumption that the best course of action to take was to simply comply with all of her wishes. She would definitely like you then. Unfortunately, this couldn't have been further from the truth. Of course, Lionel hadn't taken such action to an exaggerated degree. But he had most definitely let Ana mold many of his thoughts and tendencies, even to the point it only took him a few days by her side to ignore how much he hated the way she viewed killing. As Lionel grew, though, his own thoughts and opinions solidified and the way he viewed the world had subtly changed. He was still the same Lionel, but he was far more assertive. It was hard to say that he had truly matured, but he was definitely more of an adult. Ana thus understood that much of Lionel's infatuation had only been surface level and she could only be said to have a place in his heart. But she didn't own it. Everyone had a small bit of selfishness in their heart. Ana simply wanted Lionel to love her as much as she loved him. Nothing more, nothing less. Yip, yip. Little Black Star happily chirped, but also seemed to remind the two that they were still deep within enemy territory. Ana had already found herself straddling Lionel when Black Star's call made her blush. The little mink was right, they were technically in a very dangerous situation right now. She had been a small measure away from asking Lionel if he had a condom again. But, with her better judgment, she decided that she definitely didn't want to have her first time in this place. This chapter upload first at novel.bin.net. Lionel's head turned in a certain direction. It took several moments, so long in fact, that Ana thought that he was mistaken. But after about half a minute her gaze too sharpened. "It's fine," Lionel said. "They're humans." As soon as Lionel said these words, a group of 3 rushed out of the dense black fog. They all looked to be in terrible shape, not a single one being without a devastating injury of some sort. In fact, it could be said that they would have already died if not for a certain event causing the Raypaks they had been fighting to rush off. There didn't seem to be a decisive leader amongst the 3 while one was a woman and the other 2 were men. Lionel couldn't recognize them, so it was likely that their foggy lake hadn't been the only one. But he had to think just how big was the Raypak's nest for them to send them all in here. With all the sectors there were, and there being at least 3 golden tokens to each, there had to be many that qualified for this trial. When they 3 spotted Lionel and Ana, though, their lips couldn't help but twitch. Lionel's back was reclined against a wall as he sat on the ground. Aina, though, had straddled his waist, placing both palms on his chest. Even though they both had serious expressions on now, there was no doubt about what they must have been doing before, especially since Aina's short bee-skin skirt threatened to roll up her thigh and past her bottom. The two young men couldn't help but gulp, causing Lionel to raise an eyebrow. Seeing this, Aina almost couldn't help but giggle. Like the flip of a switch, Lionel had gone from not caring to if she got married to someone else to suddenly being prickled by looks that ultimately couldn't see anything anyway. She was suddenly fascinated by how Lionel's mind worked. Chapter 1351. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 36 seconds p.m. Chapter 1351. Be good. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1351. Be good. Lionel and Aina rose from the ground. Surprisingly, the both of them didn't seem to care much about the precarious situation they had been in. Aina simply picked up her enormous axe as though nothing had happened. Yip, yip. Little Black Star dove into Aina's chest, causing her to smile. It seemed that little guy was even more excited than she was. But, of course he had finally gotten his favorite bed back. The three youths frowned. They were suddenly acutely aware that Lionel and Aina weren't injured in the slightest. Lionel's bruises and lumps had already healed along with his cracked ribs. Aside from a small bit of dried blood that touched his body here and there was nothing else. As for Aina, she was even less injured, having been stowed away for their only major fight, a bone she had yet to finish picking with Lionel. Lionel looked over the three youths. In truth, he had no intention of taking on burdens, and it would be more difficult to avoid detection if he took 3 people with him. But he also wouldn't feel right if he simply allowed 3 people he could have helped die. We're close to the exit, Lionel said with a smile, and that was all he said. He had realized already that the method he and Aina had been taking was correct. They ruined Raypax hadn't been luring them incorrectly, but it was rather a problem of the fact Raypax would obviously be more familiar with their nest than Lionel could possibly be. So, when the ruined Raypax realized what they must want to do, cutting them off before they could reach their goal was child's play. Luckily, this meant that they were still near the entrance, or rather exit, nonetheless. However, whether it was safe passage to take or not was a different matter entirely. Lionel turned and began to walk away with Aina by his side. The trio looked at one another, frowning. They weren't sure if Lionel's words were true. They had only come to this place because they were running away. They hadn't been paying attention to where they were going. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. The lack of injuries on the pair and their nonchalance seemed to scream that they were powerful. But was it really possible to leave this nest without so much as an injury? They were all absolute geniuses in their own right. They didn't believe that the gap between them and someone else could possibly be so wide. So, could it just be that they had gotten lucky and didn't come across any enemies? Forget it, it doesn't matter. We have no idea where we're going anyway and would have to just randomly pick a direction. We might as well see if they're right about the exit. One of them spoke. Lionel didn't look back when he felt them being followed. He had already done his part. Whether they chose to follow him or not had nothing to do with him any longer at that point. As Lionel had expected, after splitting down just one more tunnel, the wind shifted and the air became slightly cleaner. After traveling several hundred more meters, Lionel came to the edge of a corner and came to a grinding halt. Aina stopped right behind him and Little Black Star grew quiet. Following their lead, the three also came to a pause. Lionel closed his eyes, his brows furrowing. There was nothing there. No guards, no sentries, nothing. He couldn't sense any force arts, no traps, and even the flow of force didn't have anything wrong with it. There wasn't even something as simple as a door, it was just opened wide to the expanse of what Lionel assumed was the void battlefield. No, there's something odd there. Lionel's brows shot up and he suddenly understood. This path sloped upward, going from deep underground to above it and forming the whole of an exit/entrance. However, on the opposite side, there was actually another entrance. It wasn't just that, there were entrances surrounding this one entirely. And beyond that, there were enormous domes riddled with holes that Lionel was fairly certain were likely the very same holes they had been looking up through earlier. There was definitely a 300-meter drop on the other side of them. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Netshit. Lionel's gaze narrowed. This wasn't just a Raypax nest. It was a field of Raypax nests. If they wanted to get out of here, they would need to somehow navigate through them all until they could find a nest on the edge to escape. Lionel was suddenly annoyed by his dad. The old man couldn't have said a single word about this? He could have at least pointed out a direction. But as things stood now, Lionel was truly uncertain of which way to go. Even though he had noticed that his senses had actually greatly improved, it still wasn't enough to cover an entire network of nests, especially when just one was so large already. On top of that, for the same reasons as before, traveling above ground definitely wasn't an option, at least not long term. It was fine if this exit didn't have guards because each nest essentially fed into one another. However, Lionel was still certain that there were many keeping an eye on the above-ground holes, or else the Raypacks would be far too easy to infiltrate. We have to take a risk. We can't just blindly choose a direction and hope for the best. I need to fly high enough into the sky to see which way is the shortest to safety. So long as I can lock onto that direction even while stuck beneath the ground, he'll be able to stay true to it. But I need the direction first. Lionel took a deep breath, his gaze steeling. Then he took a long stride forward. But just before he could do as he planned, he suddenly felt a strong force grab onto his wrist and yank him backward. Ah! Lionel looked back to find a glaring Aina. No, you don't. You're going to be a good boyfriend and tell me exactly what you're planning. Then we'll see if I should get involved or not. Lionel's lip twitched. The three youths to their backs looked toward one another, not sure of how to react. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1352. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:43 and 35 seconds p.m. Chapter 1352. Trust if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1352. Trust. Lionel sighed. Alright. The exit is around the corner, but there's nothing guarding it. Aina asked. She was smart enough to know that this was definitely not a good thing. Different species aside, the Raypacks were clearly intelligent. They wouldn't make such a rudimentary mistake. There's nothing guarding it because they don't need to guard it, at least not this exit in particular. We're currently surrounded by 3 other identical entrances that lead to other hives identical to this one. In fact, we're in a field of nests right now and my internal sight doesn't spread far enough to tell if we're nearer the middle, an edge, or what direction we should go in. The expressions of the 3 youths sunk when they heard this. They had thought that they were close to at least leaping over this first hurdle, but there was actually so much more to go. Who had set up this selection? Did they want them all to die? So you want to fly up and check which direction to go. Aina finished. There's no real other choice. Of course there's another choice. You could make an image probe to check for you. If that doesn't work, there's Blackstar. His stealth is much higher than any of our own. He could probably do it without risking being found out at all. An image probe would require materials and a force art that wouldn't be eroded by anarchic force, neither of which I have on hands right now. As for Blackstar, that is a more legitimate possibility, but I don't like it. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed, so it comes down to you being stubborn again. It isn't stubbornness, just efficiency. There's no amount of stealth that will help little Blackstar hide himself in the air. It's just relativity. Blackstar is far smaller than any one of us and also has the best evasive maneuvers. At the same time, the Raypacks likely know that there's a bunch of humans running around in their territory by now. They might not be ready to spot a little mink. And on top of that, can't little Blackstar change form as well? If it comes down to it, it might be worth exploring the possibility of using that to our advantage. I just think it's still better if I go. You aren't explaining. It's hard to explain. It isn't. I know why you want to go. For one, you don't want to put Blackstar in danger. And, secondly, you trust in your ability to react to unforeseen circumstances far more than anyone else. You're just reluctant to say so because it proves my point. Lionel opened his mouth to respond but suddenly found that he had nothing to say. Little Blackstar's head bobbed back and forth between them as the two argued, if it could even be called that. He seemed very curious about how this would end and even seemed amused about how Aina had cornered Lionel. Whenever Lionel made an assessment, there were 2 things he always took into consideration. The first was what the situation was at face value, and the second was what the situation had a chance of mutating and warping into. The first was straightforward enough, however the more likely the second was to cause his analysis to veer off path, the more likely it was that he would rather take on the burden himself. In Lionel's opinion, there was simply no one who could adapt to a change faster than he could. In fact, one of the only people to ever impress him with their adaptation ability, Emna Basiran from Crimson Hall, was a woman he almost immediately invited to become one of his generals. To this day she had still been the only person he had ever tried to recruit like that. Sometimes he still lamented that he didn't manage to win her over. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Net. These were the two forces tugging at Lionel's mind. And the truth was that even if Emna was here, he would still trust himself hundreds of times more. That was just how he was. He liked to cut out variables as much as possible, even way back to the final game he and James had played together. Thinking to this point, Lionel closed his eyes and took a breath. When he opened them again, he rubbed his thumb on Blackstar's small little head. "Ready, little guy?" "Yep, yep." Blackstar excitedly bounded into the air, flipping and vanishing into the fog before appearing around the corner. Aina smiled, but inwardly her heart was beating wildly. She felt that this was the right decision, but if things went poorly, it would become even more difficult for Lionel to make this choice again in the future. In a lot of ways, Lionel was right. He was able to adapt faster and better than most. The reason he was so confident that he could defeat people as strong as Aina despite being weaker was because raw strength wasn't his greatest asset, his mind was. Lionel had had no business defeating sixth-dimensional experts as a mere Tier 1 existence, and yet he had done so. That kind of confidence, that kind of bone-deep and unflappable poise in the face of terrible odds was all too rare. However, Aina also knew that if Lionel didn't learn how to trust that others could accomplish good as well, even if they weren't as great as him, his dreams wouldn't be able to progress very far. There was only so much a single person could accomplish. Aina looked toward Lionel's side profile, but he was already extremely focused. His gaze had frosted over, his expression had become unreadable, and an oppressive aura began to weigh down on the surroundings, suddenly making it difficult for the three youths behind them to breathe. Little Blackstar shot out of the exit like a beam of black light, then performed a sharp 90-degree turn upward, flying into the skies. Lionel could feel his partner's excitement through their connection. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.